Hey there, history hunters. Sunrise, July 11th, 1804. Two men stand on a riverbank, pistols raised. One is the Vice President of the United States. The other basically invented American money. In 31 hours, one of them will be dead. So how does a broke, illegitimate orphan from a tiny Caribbean island end up here and build the financial backbone of a whole new nation? This guy was a soldier, Washington's right-hand man, the hero of Yorktown, and the very first Treasury Secretary. Funniest part? His face is on the $10 bill today, the same money he dreamed up himself. Big thanks to Smokey On for suggesting this topic. Before we dive in, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. What city and what time is it right now? Lights down, get comfy and let's go. To understand how a man ends up on a riverbank at dawn with a pistol in his hand, you have to go back to where he began. And where he began was about as far from that fateful morning as a person could possibly get. So let's roll the calendar back nearly 5 decades, swap the cold New Jersey shoreline for the warm turquoise water of the Caribbean, and meet our hero before he was a hero, before he was anybody at all, when he was just a small boy on a small island that most people couldn't find on a map even if you paid them. The island was called Nevis, and the town was called Charlestown, and the date was the 11th of January, though the year is where things get slippery. Most historians settle on 1755. Alexander himself, later in life, preferred to tell people it was 1757, which would have made him conveniently younger and more precociously brilliant for every impressive thing he ever did. We may never know for certain which date is correct, partly because record-keeping on a tiny sugar island in the middle of the 18th century was not exactly a precise science, and partly because the man in question had a lifelong habit of arranging the facts of his own story in whatever shape flattered him most. Honestly, you have to admire the audacity. Most of us round our ages down by a year or two at a party. Alexander tried to do it to the history books. Now, to set the scene properly, you should know that Nevis at this time was a speck, a genuinely tiny dot of land, gorgeous to look at, dominated by a single cloud-wrapped volcanic peak, and almost entirely given over to one business and one business only: sugar. The whole island ran on it. The economy, the social order, the daily rhythm of life, all of it revolved around enormous plantations growing cane, processing it into raw sugar and molasses, and shipping it across the ocean to sweeten the tea and rum of people in Europe who had absolutely no idea and no interest in where any of it came from. It was beautiful and brutal in roughly equal measure, which unfortunately was the standard package deal for the colonial Caribbean. Into this world arrived Alexander's parents, and both of them carried baggage. Let's start with the father, because his story is a small masterpiece of ambition meeting reality and losing badly. James Hamilton was the 4th son of a Scottish laird, which is a fancy old word for a minor lord who owns a respectable patch of land somewhere in the Highlands. The estate in question sat in Ayrshire, and there was the rub. Being the 4th son of a Scottish landowner in this era was a bit like being the 4th person in line to inherit a single sandwich. By the time the older brothers had taken their shares, there was nothing left for you but the wrapper. The eldest son got the land, the title, and the future. The younger sons got a firm handshake and a strong recommendation to go make their fortunes elsewhere, preferably very far away. So James did what countless younger sons of minor nobility did. He sailed to the West Indies in 1741 with stars in his eyes and a head full of sugar dreams, fully convinced he was going to make a glittering fortune in the cane trade and return home triumphant. This did not happen. What happened instead is that James Hamilton turned out to be one of those people who is endlessly enthusiastic about business and endlessly terrible at it, a combination that has bankrupted optimists across every century. He drifted from venture to venture, from island to island, from one failed scheme to the next, always certain that the big break was just around the corner and always discovering that the corner led to another corner. He had the dreams of a tycoon and the bank balance of a man who could not afford lunch. Naturally, none of his projects ever came together. The mother is where the story gets genuinely dramatic, and frankly, a little ahead of its time. Her name was Rachel Fawcett, and before Alexander was even a thought, she had already lived through a saga. As a young woman, she had been married off to a man named Johann Lavian, a Danish merchant who, depending on which account you believe, was either considerably older than her, considerably duller than her, or both. The marriage was a disaster. Rachel was intelligent, spirited, and absolutely not interested in spending the rest of her life shackled to a man she could not stand, which, in the 18th century, was a remarkably modern attitude to have, and an extremely inconvenient one to act on. So she left him. And here is where Johann revealed himself to be a genuinely vindictive piece of work. When Rachel walked out, he did not simply let her go. He had her thrown in jail. The official charge was adultery, the supposed evidence being that she had dared to leave and live her own life, and the law of the island at the time gave her husband enough power to make that accusation stick. She spent several months locked up, which was apparently meant to teach her a lesson about obedience. It taught her something else entirely. The moment she got out, she fled the island for good and never looked back, leaving Johann, leaving the marriage, leaving everything. You can practically hear the door slam from here. Johann, however, was not finished being petty. Years later, he finally got around to filing for a formal divorce, and he did it in the most spiteful way the law allowed. Under the terms he arranged, he was free to remarry whenever he liked. Rachel, on the other hand, was legally forbidden from ever marrying again. He essentially used the courts to make sure that even after she was gone from his life, she could never fully build a new one. It was a parting gift of pure resentment, and it would have enormous consequences because it meant that when Rachel later met James Hamilton and the two of them began a life together, they could never legally marry. Not because they did not want to, but because a bitter ex-husband halfway across the Caribbean had made absolutely sure of it. And that is the precise legal technicality that defined Alexander Hamilton's entire childhood. He was born outside of marriage. In the cold language of the time, he was illegitimate, a bastard, base-born, and a whole thesaurus of unpleasant words that respectable society used to make sure a child knew exactly where he stood, which was at the very bottom. This was not a minor social inconvenience. In the rigid, status-obsessed world of the colonial Caribbean, being illegitimate slammed doors in your face before you were even old enough to reach the handles. The most immediate door it slammed was the schoolhouse. The Church of England ran the respectable school on the island, the proper place where the children of proper families learned their letters and their Latin and their place in the world. And the Church of England, in its infinite wisdom, decided that a boy born out of wedlock was not the sort of child it wished to educate alongside the legitimate offspring of married couples. So young Alexander, who would grow up to outread, outwrite, and outargue practically everyone he ever met, was turned away from formal schooling on the grounds of a marriage technicality he had absolutely no part in arranging. The institution that prided itself on Christian charity took one look at the circumstances of his birth and said, in effect, take it elsewhere. So his education happened the only way it could, which was patched together at home and on the side. His mother taught him what she could, and she was clearly no fool. Among other things, she taught him French, the language of trade and culture, which would turn out to be one of the single most useful things anyone ever gave him, though nobody could have known that at the time. He picked up reading voraciously, devouring whatever books happened to be within reach. There is a charming and probably true detail that the family owned a modest collection of around 30 books, which the boy is said to have worked through repeatedly, the way a starving person revisits the same small meal. It was not much, but it was enough to light a fire, and that fire never went out. Now, we should pause and be honest about the world this child was growing up in, because it was not a postcard. Behind the lovely beaches and the swaying palms, Nevis and its neighbouring islands ran on a system of enslaved labour that was as cruel as any the world has produced. The sugar plantations that made a handful of European families rich were worked by enslaved Africans under conditions that were, to put it plainly, designed to extract the maximum amount of labour in the shortest amount of time, with no regard whatsoever for the human beings doing it. Public punishments were a normal feature of life. Human beings were bought and sold at auction the way you might trade livestock, families torn apart by a stranger's signature on a piece of paper. And the mortality figures are the kind of statistic that stops you cold. By many estimates, a majority of enslaved people brought to these islands did not survive their first 5 years there. 3 out of every 5, by some accounts, were worked to death or killed by disease before they had a chance to grow old. It was an economy built quite literally on disposable human lives, and everyone profiting from it found a way to look the other way. Young Alexander grew up watching all of it, every day, up close. He saw the auctions, he saw the cruelty, he saw the cold arithmetic of an entire society that had decided some people simply did not count, and it left a mark on him that would last his whole life. Among the founders of the United States, Hamilton would later stand out as one of the more consistent opponents of slavery, and a lot of historians trace that conviction directly back to these years, to a childhood spent inside the machinery of the trade, seeing exactly what it was and exactly what it cost. It is one of the rare cases where a terrible environment seems to have produced, in at least one person watching it, a lasting determination to do better. Naturally, the people who actually ran the system felt no such thing, but the boy taking notes from the sidelines came away with very different ideas. Meanwhile, the small, unstable family Alexander belonged to was about to fall apart entirely, and it did so in stages, each worse than the last. The first blow came in 1766 when James Hamilton, the perpetually failing father, walked out for good. The exact reasons are murky, as so much of this story is, but the most likely explanation is the saddest and simplest one. He had failed at everything, he was deeply in debt, and a part of him may have reasoned that Rachel and the boys would actually be better off without a broke man dragging them further down. Whether or not that was true, the effect was the same. He left, he did not come back, and Alexander would not see his father again for the rest of his life. The man who gave him his name gave him essentially nothing else, and then vanished, which is unfortunately a pattern that repeats across far too many of these stories. The second and far heavier blow came in February of 1768. A fever swept through, the kind that moved fast and showed no mercy, and both Rachel and Alexander caught it. Picture the scene, because it is genuinely harrowing. Mother and son lying ill in the same small bed, both burning up, with the local medicine of the era doing its usual heroic job of making everything slightly worse. The treatments of the day mostly involved bleeding the patient, on the theory that draining a sick person of their blood would somehow help, a theory that was wrong in nearly every conceivable way, but enjoyed an astonishingly long run of popularity anyway. Alexander, young and tough, pulled through. Rachel did not. She died, leaving her son an orphan in every meaningful sense, since his father was already gone and was never coming back. And then, just to twist the knife, the legal system showed up to make a bad situation worse. Because Alexander was born outside of marriage, he had no legal claim to his mother's modest estate. Instead, the court awarded what little she had left to her legitimate son, the child from her miserable first marriage to Johann Lavienne, a boy Alexander barely knew. So the son who had nursed her through her final illness, who had been at her side to the very end, got nothing, while the son she had not seen in years, the product of the marriage she had fled, walked away with the inheritance. The law looked at the situation, considered the human reality of it, and chose to follow the technicality straight off a cliff. It was the kind of decision that makes perfect sense on paper and no sense at all anywhere else. There was supposed to be a safety net in the form of a relative. A cousin named Peter Lytton stepped in as a guardian to look after the orphaned boys, which sounds like a hopeful turn until you learn how it ended. Within a short time, Peter Lytton took his own life. It was a final devastating piece of the puzzle, removing the last adult who was supposed to be responsible for Alexander's welfare. By the time the dust settled in 1769, this teenage boy had lost his father to abandonment, his mother to fever, his inheritance to the law, and his guardian to tragedy. He was, for all practical purposes, completely alone in the world, with no money, no name worth anything in respectable circles, and no obvious path to anything better. If you had walked up to anyone on Nevis in 1769 and predicted that this particular orphan would one day design the financial system of a great nation and end up on its money, they would have politely suggested you go lie down somewhere cool. Before we move on, there is one more wrinkle worth mentioning, because it is the kind of historical rumour that refuses to die and is too delicious to leave out. There was talk, both during Alexander's life and long after, that James Hamilton might not actually have been his real father. The basis for the gossip was a striking physical resemblance between young Alexander and a boy named Edward Stevens, the son of a prosperous local merchant named Thomas Stevens, in whose orbit Alexander spent a good deal of time. The two boys looked enough alike that people whispered they might be half-brothers, which would mean the merchant Thomas Stevens, not the failed Scotsman James Hamilton, was the actual father. There is no proof of this whatsoever, and serious historians treat it as exactly the sort of unverifiable rumour that tends to attach itself to famous people after the fact. But it is out there. It has been out there for over 2 centuries, and it adds one final question mark to a childhood that was already swimming in them. Either way, the boy who emerged from all of this had a remarkable talent for landing on his feet, which he was about to need more than ever. Because here is the thing about hitting rock bottom at the age of 13 or 14. There is nowhere to go but up, and Alexander, against every reasonable expectation, started climbing almost immediately. Out of necessity, he took the only opportunity available to a clever, penniless orphan, which was a job. He went to work as a clerk for a trading firm, a busy import-export operation run under the name Courtwright and Kruger, and he moved into the household of the merchant family connected to the Stevens Circle, the same circle that had sparked all that rumour in the first place. And it is here, in a dusty counting house on a small Caribbean island, surrounded by ledgers and bills of lading and the endless paperwork of ocean commerce, that the seeds of everything he would later become were quietly planted. Now, on the surface, a clerk's job at a trading firm sounds about as glamorous as it gets, which is to say not at all. We're talking about long hours of arithmetic, copying figures, keeping accounts, and tracking shipments. But for a boy with Alexander's particular brain, this was not drudgery. It was the perfect education, arguably better than anything the snooty Church of England school could have offered him. He learned to keep books with precision. He learned to handle money, and not just one kind of money. The Caribbean was a chaotic crossroads of competing empires, which meant a working clerk had to juggle British pounds, Spanish dollars, Dutch and Danish currencies, and a dozen other forms of payment, constantly converting one into another and keeping track of fluctuating values. He became fluent in the language of trade, in credit and debt, in profit and loss, in the practical mechanics of how goods and money actually flowed across an ocean. He learned to track ships, to anticipate markets, to understand the rhythm of supply and demand long before anyone had given those ideas fancy academic names. He saw how the entire plantation economy fit together, the cane and the sugar and the rum and the credit that financed all of it, and he saw it not from a textbook, but from inside the engine room. This was the foundation of the financial genius the whole world would later marvel at. The man who would one day stand in front of the United States Congress and explain, in dizzying detail, how to fund a national debt and build a banking system, had taught himself the basics as a teenager balancing the books of a sugar trader. There is no finance degree on earth that beats actually doing the work, and Alexander did the work harder than anyone. His talent did not go unnoticed. Toward the end of 1771, something remarkable happened that tells you everything about how much his employers had come to trust him. The owner of the firm needed to travel to New York for an extended period to deal with health problems, and he was going to be gone for around 5 months. Now, a sensible business owner faced with a 5-month absence would typically leave the operation in the hands of a seasoned adult with decades of experience. Instead, this owner left the entire business in the hands of Alexander, who was, at this point, around 16 years old. The man handed the keys of a complex international trading operation to a teenager and sailed off, presumably with full confidence, and possibly with a faint sense of relief that he had someone this capable to cover for him, and the teenager ran it. For 5 months this orphaned boy managed the affairs of the whole firm, corresponding with ship captains, handling money, making decisions, keeping the entire enterprise afloat, with no adult supervision and apparently no disasters to show for it. 16 years old, in charge of the shop, and instead of running it into the ground, he kept the lights on and the ledgers balanced. Most 16-year-olds in any era are not to be trusted with anything more complicated than the television remote. This one was running an international business and doing it well. It was a preview of a lifelong pattern. Whenever Alexander Hamilton was handed responsibility far beyond his years, he did not buckle, he rose. But here is the wonderful contradiction at the heart of the young man. For all his head for numbers and commerce, his real ambitions pointed somewhere else entirely. He did not want to be a clerk. He did not want to spend his life balancing other people's accounts on a small island where the ceiling was permanently low for a boy of his background. He wanted out, and he wanted up, and he wanted a stage worthy of the things he felt churning inside him. There is a famous line attributed to a letter he wrote around this time, in which the teenage Alexander confessed that he despised the lowly station his life had condemned him to, that he was willing to risk everything to rise above it, and that, as strange as it sounded, he almost wished for a war, because a war was the kind of upheaval that could let a nobody become a somebody. Coming from a 14 or 15-year-old clerk on a sugar island, that is either alarming or magnificent, and history would soon decide it was both. In the meantime, he was doing something else that hinted at the writer he would become. In his spare hours, Alexander wrote. Poetry mostly, the earnest and overwrought verse of an intelligent young man with big feelings and a small audience, which he sent off to the local newspaper, the Royal Danish American Gazette. The poems themselves are not exactly literary treasures, and nobody is rushing to anthologize the teenage poetry of Alexander Hamilton, but they reveal something important, which is that this young man had an itch to put words on paper and get them in front of people, an itch that would, before long, turn into one of the most powerful pens in American history. The boy who scribbled lovesick verse for a Caribbean newspaper would grow into the man who wrote the founding arguments of a republic. Everybody starts somewhere, and his somewhere involved a lot of rhyming. Around 1772, a person entered Alexander's life who would change its direction completely, and his name was Hugh Knox. Knox was a Presbyterian minister, a learned and generous man with a sharp mind and, crucially, a personal library. He took an interest in the bright, hungry, articulate young clerk, and he did something for Alexander that the Church of England school had refused to do years earlier. He opened a door. Specifically, he opened the door to his book collection and let the young man read his fill, feeding a mind that had been starving for exactly this kind of nourishment. A mentor with a library is one of the greatest gifts a curious young person can receive, and Alexander received it at precisely the moment he was ready to make the most of it. And then came the hurricane. We have arrived at the single strangest and most pivotal twist in this entire chapter of his life, a moment where a natural disaster of all things became Alexander Hamilton's launching pad. On the 30th of August in 1772, a tremendous hurricane tore through the islands, the kind of devastating storm that flattens buildings, sinks ships, and reshapes coastlines. It was by any measure a catastrophe, and the 17-year-old clerk in the aftermath sat down and wrote a letter about it. But this was no ordinary letter. Alexander poured everything he had into describing the storm, the terror and the chaos and the raw power of it, in language so vivid and dramatic and emotionally charged that anyone who read it could practically feel the wind and the rain on their own face. It was part eyewitness account, part philosophical meditation, part roaring display of pure writing talent. He had originally written it as a private letter, but his mentor Hugh Knox read it, recognized immediately that this was something special, and urged him to allow it to be published in the newspaper. Alexander agreed, and the letter ran for all the island to see. The reaction was, to put it mildly, enormous. The local readers, including the wealthy and influential businessmen of the community, were astonished that such a powerful piece of writing had come from the pen of a teenage clerk with no formal education and no money to his name. And here is where the story becomes almost too perfect, the kind of thing that would feel contrived if it appeared in a novel. The local notables were so impressed, so convinced that this young man's talents were being wasted on a small island, that they took up a collection. They pooled their money together specifically to send Alexander Hamilton to North America to get a proper education. A teenager wrote one extraordinary essay about a storm, and a group of strangers were moved enough to literally fund his future. His ticket off the island was a piece of writing. If that does not tell you something about the power this man's pen would come to hold, nothing will. So, in the winter of 1772, Alexander Hamilton boarded a ship and sailed away from the Caribbean, away from the small island and the small ceiling and the long shadow of his birth, bound for the colonies of North America and the wide-open future he had been desperate for. He was leaving behind everything he had ever known, which, to be fair, had not treated him especially well. Whatever nervousness he felt about the journey, he had to be at least a little thrilled to finally have the stage he had been dreaming of, even if he had no clear idea yet of what he was going to do on it. The crossing itself was no pleasure cruise, and there is a story, fitting for a young man whose whole life seemed to attract drama, that the ship he sailed on actually caught fire during the voyage, and the crew spent a frantic stretch of time battling the flames before limping into port. Whether the details are exact or slightly embroidered over the years, it sets the tone nicely. Even getting to America very nearly went up in smoke. The boy who once half-jokingly wished for a war to shake up his prospects could not seem to travel anywhere without the universe arranging some sort of catastrophe for him to survive, and survive it he did, stepping onto North American soil, hungry, broke, and absolutely electric with ambition. He did not arrive entirely alone in the world either. His close companion Edward Stevens, the very boy whose resemblance had sparked all that whispering about Alexander's true parentage, had also come to North America to pursue an education, in his case a medical one. Having a familiar face from home in the same strange new country must have made the leap a little less terrifying, and the two would remain connected for years. It is a small but human detail in a story that can sometimes feel like a relentless parade of hardship. Even the loneliest orphan in the colonies had at least one friend who knew where he came from. He landed and made his way to the New York area, and his first stop on the educational ladder was a preparatory school called the Elizabethtown Academy, located across the water in New Jersey. This was essentially a finishing school designed to get promising young men ready for college, and Alexander threw himself into it with the ferocious intensity that defined everything he ever attempted. He had years of formal education to catch up on, and he intended to catch up fast. He studied Latin, the language of scholarship and law. He studied Greek, the language of philosophy and the classics. He studied mathematics, which, given his clerking background, was probably the part that came easiest. He worked, by all accounts, like a man possessed, cramming years of learning into months, driven by the knowledge that this opportunity had been bought for him by other people's generosity and could not be wasted. And then came the first of many moments where Alexander Hamilton's towering self-confidence collided with an institution's sense of how things ought to be done. Less than 6 months into his preparatory studies, the impatient young man decided he was ready for college, and not just any college. He set his sights on the College of New Jersey, the institution we now know as Princeton, and he approached its leadership with a bold proposition. He wanted to enroll, but he wanted to do it on his own terms, advancing through the program at his own accelerated pace rather than plodding through the standard fixed years of study like everyone else. In other words, the recently arrived orphan with barely 6 months of catch-up schooling under his belt walked up to one of the colony's most prestigious colleges and essentially asked them to bend their entire system to accommodate how quickly he intended to learn. Princeton, unsurprisingly, said no. The college's leadership considered his request and turned it down flat, declining to make a special exception for an ambitious young man in a hurry. You can imagine the institutional shrug. Rules were rules, the program was the program, and they were not about to rearrange centuries of academic tradition because one confident teenager felt he could go faster. It is one of history's quiet ironies that the school which rejected the accelerated ambitions of Alexander Hamilton would spend the following centuries watching him become one of the most consequential figures the young country ever produced. Their loss, as the saying goes, and it was a considerable one. But Alexander was not the type to be stopped by a single closed door, having already survived the closing of just about every door imaginable. He took his ambitions a short distance away to King's College in New York City, an institution you would know today by its current name, Columbia University. King's College was willing to take him, and so it was here, in the heart of New York, that Alexander Hamilton's formal higher education truly began, and here that his mind opened onto the world of ideas that would shape the rest of his life, and, eventually, the shape of an entire nation. Because at King's College, Alexander began to read the great thinkers of the age, the political philosophers whose ideas were, at that very moment, lighting fires in the minds of restless people all across the colonies. He read John Locke, the English philosopher whose arguments about natural rights, government by consent, and the idea that people have liberties no ruler can rightfully take away would become the intellectual bedrock of the American Revolution. He read David Hume, the brilliant and sceptical Scottish thinker who wrote about human nature, society, and the workings of government with a clear-eyed realism that suited Alexander's own temperament perfectly. And he read Montesquieu, the French philosopher whose theories about separating the powers of government into different branches, so that no single part could grow too strong, would later echo through the very structure of the United States Constitution. This was heady, dangerous, exhilarating material for a young man to be reading in New York in the early 1770s, because these were not just abstract ideas confined to dusty books. They were the live wires of a coming revolution. All around him, the relationship between the American colonies and their faraway rulers in Britain was souring fast, and the philosophical questions Alexander was studying in his books were about to spill out of the classroom and into the streets, the assemblies, and eventually the battlefields. He had arrived at exactly the right place at exactly the right moment, a young man armed with a powerful pen, a head full of revolutionary philosophy, and a burning, almost desperate hunger to make his mark on the world. It was not all reading and reflection either. Alexander threw himself into the social and intellectual life of the college with the same intensity he brought to everything, joining a student debating society where young men sharpen their arguments against one another the way fencers sharpen blades. For someone with his gifts, this was less a hobby than a training ground. He was learning to think on his feet, to marshal facts into arguments, to anticipate the other side and dismantle it before it got going. All skills that would serve him spectacularly well in the courtrooms, the assembly halls, and the political brawls of his later life. The other students quickly learned that arguing against the small, intense young man from the islands was an exhausting business, because he simply did not tire and he simply did not quit. He read more, prepared more, and wanted it more than almost anyone around him, and in a contest of stamina and conviction, that combination is very hard to beat. The orphan from the Sugar Island had made it to the colonies, and the colonies were about to catch fire. Alexander Hamilton, it turned out, had walked straight into the centre of history, and he had absolutely no intention of standing quietly at the edge of it. The young man who walked through the gates of King's College had arrived in a powder keg, though it would be fairer to say the powder keg had been filling up for the better part of a decade before he ever set foot on the docks. The quarrel between the American colonies and the government back in London was not a sudden thing, and it had not started over anything so dramatic as a battle or a betrayal. It had started, as the most furious arguments in human history so often do, over money, specifically over taxes, and even more specifically over the maddening question of who got to decide them. The trouble had been building since 1765 when London passed the Stamp Act, a piece of legislation requiring colonists to pay a tax on practically every printed thing in their lives, from legal documents to newspapers to playing cards. The colonists were not necessarily opposed to taxes in the abstract, which is a sentence very few people have ever uttered, but they were furious about the principle of the thing. They had no representatives in the distant parliament that was busily taxing them, and they took the radical position that being taxed by a body you had no say in was fundamentally a swindle. No taxation without representation became the rallying cry, and it had the great advantage of being both catchy and genuinely persuasive. It also captured a real grievance, since the colonists were being asked to fund a distant government's decisions, while having no voice whatsoever in making them, an arrangement that tends to breed resentment in any century. Then came the Townshend Acts in 1767, slapping duties on a range of imported goods and somehow managing to make everyone even angrier, which by that point was no small achievement. And then, of course, there was the famous evening of the 16th of December in 1773, when a group of colonists in Boston, some of them lightly disguised as Native Americans in a costume choice that fooled absolutely no one, climbed aboard ships in the harbour and dumped an enormous quantity of British tea straight into the water. This was the Boston Tea Party, a name that makes it sound considerably more genteel than it was. It was, in plain terms, the deliberate destruction of a fortune in private property as a political protest, and London reacted to it with all the calm restraint of a person who has just discovered someone has thrown their entire pantry into the sea. The crackdown that followed only poured oil on the fire, and the colonies edged closer and closer to open rebellion. What had begun as a dispute over taxes had quietly become a question about the very nature of authority, and questions like that, once asked, are very difficult to unask. Into this boiling situation stepped Alexander, who, as we have established, was not a young man inclined to watch important things happen from a safe distance. By July of 1774, the 19-year-old college student found himself at a large public gathering of the Patriot faction, the group loosely known as the Sons of Liberty, and what happened there became an instant legend. The story goes that Alexander, more or less on impulse, stood up and delivered a speech in defense of the Patriot cause and the Boston protest, and that the crowd, expecting some forgettable remarks from an unknown youth, was instead left genuinely stunned by the force and eloquence of what poured out of him. He argued that resisting Britain, including through boycotts of British goods, was nothing less than the salvation of North America, and he made the case with a maturity and conviction that seemed impossible from someone so young and so new to the country. People reportedly walked away asking each other who on earth that young man was. It was the public debut of a voice that the country would be hearing a great deal more of. But Alexander did not stop at speeches, because his most lethal weapon was always the pen, and he picked it up with enthusiasm. He began writing political pamphlets, published anonymously as was the fashion of the day, in which he made the intellectual case for the colonial position with a sophistication that startled his readers and infuriated his opponents. Drawing on the political philosophy he had been devouring, He argued that the rights of the colonists were not gifts handed down by a generous king or a merciful parliament. They were natural rights given by God himself, woven into the very fabric of what it meant to be a free human being, and therefore no parliament on earth, however powerful, had any legitimate authority to strip them away. It was bold stuff, and what made it especially remarkable was that the pamphlets were so well argued and so densely reasoned that many readers simply refused to believe they had come from a teenage student. Some assumed the author had to be a seasoned and respected older statesman writing in disguise. The idea that this thunderous defense of American liberty was being composed by a barely 20-year-old immigrant from a Caribbean sugar island would have struck most people as absurd. It was, however, entirely true, and here is where Alexander's character reveals one of its most interesting contradictions, the tension that would define him for the rest of his life. For all that he was a passionate revolutionary, ready to argue and fight for the colonial cause, he was also deeply, almost instinctively frightened of disorder. He believed in revolution as a path to a better, more rational, more lawful society. What he did not believe in was the mob, the angry crowd taking the law into its own hands, and he proved it in dramatic fashion. On the 10th of May in 1775, a furious crowd descended on the home of Miles Cooper, the president of King's College, who was a well-known loyalist firmly on the side of the British Crown. The mob intended to do him serious harm, and they were in exactly the sort of righteous, blood-up mood that makes violence feel justified to everyone involved. Alexander, who disagreed with nearly everything Cooper stood for politically, did something genuinely revealing. He stood on the steps and held the crowd off, talking, stalling, lecturing the assembled mob about the dangers of mob rule and the shame they would bring on the patriot cause by harming the man, buying enough time for Cooper to slip out the back and escape to safety. Picture the scene, because it is a perfect snapshot of who Alexander was. A young revolutionary, physically defending a man whose politics he despised, not out of any love for the loyalist cause, but out of a profound conviction that a society which let angry crowds decide who lived and died was no better than the tyranny it claimed to be replacing. He wanted a revolution of laws and reason, not a revolution of pitchforks and panic, and that distinction would sit at the centre of his entire political philosophy. It also, as it happens, made him a great many enemies among people who found his fastidiousness about mobs rather inconvenient. Talk, however, was about to give way to gunpowder, because in April of 1775 the long-simmering conflict finally boiled over into actual war. At Lexington and Concord, in the countryside outside Boston, colonial militiamen and British soldiers exchanged the first shots of the American Revolution, the famous shot heard round the world, and there was no walking it back after that. The argument over taxes had become a war for independence, and Alexander, that strange young man who had once half-wished for exactly such an upheaval, to give a nobody the chance to become a somebody, was not about to sit it out in a library. He threw himself into preparing for war with the same obsessive intensity he brought to everything, which by now you will recognize as his defining trait. He joined a volunteer militia company, and characteristically, he did not just show up and learn to march, he studied. He got his hands on books about military strategy, artillery, gunnery and tactics, and he taught himself the science of war the way he had taught himself everything else, by reading relentlessly and absorbing it whole. While other young volunteers were learning which end of the musket to point at the enemy, Alexander was teaching himself the mathematics of cannon fire. Naturally, this paid off. By March of 1776, the colony of New York had appointed him captain of an artillery company, putting roughly 68 men under his command. He was around 21 years old, leading a unit of gunners in a war against the most powerful empire on the planet, which is the kind of responsibility that tends to either break a young man or reveal exactly what he is made of. In Alexander's case, it was very much the latter. He ran his company the way he did everything, with exacting standards and a refusal to tolerate sloppiness. He drilled his gunners hard, kept his equipment in good order, and pushed to have his men well clothed and well disciplined, taking a personal pride in the unit that observers noticed and remembered. There is a certain irony in a self-taught artillery officer being fussier about military precision than men who had trained for years, but Alexander had read the manuals so thoroughly that he often knew the theory better than the veterans knew the practice. Soldiers under a careless commander tend to die for no good reason, and Alexander, having already lost everything that could be lost in his personal life, was not about to lose his men through inattention. The company became known as a sharp, reliable outfit, and its young captain became known as someone going places, assuming the war did not get him killed first, which, given how often he put himself in the line of fire, was never a safe assumption. The early stages of the war were, to put it diplomatically, not a triumphant march to glory. They were closer to a series of narrow escapes punctuated by outright disasters, and the American commander, General George Washington, spent a great deal of this period demonstrating that one of the most important skills in warfare is knowing how to retreat without your entire army falling apart in the process. Alexander and his artillery company were right in the thick of these grim, dangerous withdrawals, and this is precisely where the young captain began to make a name for himself, not by winning glorious victories, but by being cool, competent, and reliable in moments when everything was going catastrophically wrong. When the Americans were forced into a desperate retreat from Brooklyn Heights, Alexander's gunners were part of the rear action, helping cover the withdrawal of an army that very nearly got trapped and destroyed. He distinguished himself again at Harlem Heights, and again during the difficult crossing of the Raritan River, where his artillery helped slow the British advance and protect the retreating American forces. There is a recurring theme in these episodes, and it is worth lingering on because it tells you something about the man. Alexander's reputation was built not in the easy moments but in the awful ones, when the army was fleeing, when morale was collapsing, when a lesser officer might have lost his nerve. He kept his head, he handled his guns with precision, and he made himself the kind of officer that commanders learn they can depend on when the situation is at its bleakest. In an army that spent most of its early existence losing, being good at not getting everyone killed during the retreat was, frankly, an underrated and enormously valuable talent. Then came the moment that turned the entire war around, and Alexander's cannons were right in the middle of it. By the end of 1776, the American cause was in genuine peril. The army was shrinking, enlistments were expiring, morale was somewhere near the floor, and the whole revolution looked as though it might simply fizzle out from sheer exhaustion and despair. Washington needed a victory badly, and he conceived of one of the boldest, most audacious gambles of the entire war. On Christmas night, he led his battered army across the icy Delaware River, in the dark, through a brutal storm, to launch a surprise attack on the enemy garrison stationed at Trenton. The garrison was made up of Hessians, German soldiers hired by the British to fight in America, professional troops who were not exactly expecting to be ambushed in the freezing pre-dawn hours of the day after Christmas. The crossing that got the Americans there was an ordeal in itself, the river choked with chunks of ice, the boats heavy with men and horses and cannons, the wind driving sleet sideways into faces that had no business being out in such weather. Moving artillery across a half-frozen river in the dark is precisely as miserable and dangerous as it sounds, and the fact that the guns arrived intact and ready to fire was a small triumph of stubbornness over common sense. The Americans fell on the garrison, and Alexander's artillery played a crucial role, his cannons positioned to dominate the streets of the town and pour fire onto the disoriented defenders. The surprise was total, the fighting was sharp, and the result was a stunning American victory in which nearly 1,000 Hessian soldiers were captured. After months of retreat and gloom, here, finally, was a triumph, and it electrified the colonies, breathing new life into a cause that had been all but written off. Alexander, the artillery captain whose guns had helped command those frozen streets, had been part of the most important morale victory of the early war. Not bad for a young man whose biggest worry a few years earlier had been balancing the books of a sugar trader. And then there is the story from early 1777, the one that may be partly legend but is far too good to leave on the cutting room floor, and which marks the precise moment that the most important man in America finally noticed the young immigrant. During the fighting around Princeton, in New Jersey, the Americans found themselves engaged near the college there, the very institution that had once turned down Alexander's request to study at his own accelerated pace. There was a chapel on the grounds, and inside it hung a portrait of King George II. As the story goes, Alexander's artillery opened fire, and one of his cannonballs flew straight into the building and tore through the royal portrait, decapitating the painted king in a moment of accidental symbolism so perfect that it almost seemed scripted. The young man rejected by the college had returned with cannons, and depending on how literally you take the tale, given its chapel a rather emphatic redecoration. Whatever the precise truth of it, the broader fact is solid. Around this time, General Washington began to take serious notice of the brilliant, fearless young artillery officer, and that quiet act of attention was about to change Alexander Hamilton's life forever. On the 1st of March in 1777, the invitation came that would alter the entire trajectory of his career. Washington asked Alexander to join his personal staff as an aide-de-camp, with the rank of lieutenant colonel. To grasp how enormous this was, you have to understand what the position actually meant. Being on Washington's staff was not some ceremonial honor where you stood around looking decorative in a nice uniform. It was the beating heart of the entire American war effort, and the aides were the men who kept that heart pumping. And among those aides, Alexander quickly became something close to indispensable, for a reason that says a great deal about both men. Washington, for all his towering virtues as a leader, was not a gifted writer. He was a man of action and presence and steady judgment, but composing elegant, persuasive, precisely worded letters and orders was simply not his strength. Alexander, on the other hand, could write the way a master craftsman works wood. He could take a vague idea, a rough instinct, a tangle of Washington's thoughts, and transform it into a crisp, eloquent, devastatingly effective document. And so the 22-year-old aide effectively became Washington's chief of staff in everything but name, the indispensable right hand who turned the commander's intentions into the flood of correspondence that ran the war. He drafted letters to Congress, to generals, to governors, to suppliers, handling the staggering administrative machinery of an army that was perpetually short of money, food, gunpowder, and basically everything else an army requires to function. Before long, Alexander was not merely transcribing Washington's wishes. He was trusted to issue orders in Washington's name, to make decisions, to handle delicate negotiations, to act as the general's voice. It was an extraordinary level of responsibility for a man barely out of his college years, and it placed him at the very centre of the revolution, privy to its strategy, its secrets, and its constant crises. He was, in effect, getting a graduate education in how to run a government under the most demanding conditions imaginable, and he was getting it at the elbow of the most important man on the continent. The lessons he absorbed in those years about leadership, administration, finance, and the brutal practicalities of building something from almost nothing would shape everything he later did to construct a nation. The workload itself was crushing in a way that is easy to underestimate, since drafting letters does not sound like the stuff of heroism. But the volume was relentless. The army generated a staggering river of correspondence, and a great deal of it flowed across Alexander's desk, often by candlelight late into the night, after the rest of the camp had collapsed into sleep. He wrote and wrote, until his hand cramped and the words began to blur, handling matters that range from urgent strategy to the endless grinding business of begging Congress for supplies that never seemed to arrive in sufficient quantity. Washington's aides were known, somewhat fondly, as the general's military family, a tight-knit group of bright young officers who lived and worked in close quarters, ate together, argued together, and shared the peculiar pressure of running a revolution on too little sleep and far too little money. For a young man who had never really had a stable family of his own, there was something quietly significant about finding himself at the heart of one, even one held together by paperwork and gunpowder rather than blood. It was also during these years that Alexander forged two of the most important friendships of his life, both with young men cut from a similar cloth, idealistic, brave, and burning with conviction. The first was John Laurens, the son of a prominent statesman who served as president of the Continental Congress. Laurens was everything Alexander admired, courageous to the point of recklessness, principled, and passionately devoted to the cause of liberty in a way that went well beyond slogans. The two became extraordinarily close, the kind of intense, devoted friendship that men formed in the crucible of war, and Laurens would become one of the few people Alexander truly opened up to. The second friend was a young Frenchman, only 19 years old, who had crossed an ocean to fight for American freedom out of sheer romantic idealism. His name was the Marquis de Lafayette, and he would become one of the most beloved figures of the Revolution and a lifelong friend to Alexander. Lafayette had wealth, a famous title, and connections at the French court, all of which made him useful in ways that went well beyond the battlefield. But what bound him to Alexander was something simpler, a shared conviction and a shared youth, spent gambling everything on a cause that might easily have ended with all of them hanged as traitors. Picture three young men, all in their late teens and early 20s, all convinced they were going to remake the world, drawn together in the heart of a war. It was a friendship forged in fire, and it would matter enormously. The war itself, meanwhile, ground on through its mixture of catastrophe and stubborn endurance. In September of 1777, the Americans suffered a serious defeat at the Battle of Brandywine, where Washington's army was outmaneuvered and beaten, opening the road for the British to capture the rebel capital of Philadelphia. It was the kind of setback that, in the long ledger of this war, was depressingly familiar. But around the same time, far to the north, the Americans won a crucial victory at Saratoga, defeating an entire British army and capturing it. Saratoga was a turning point of historic importance, not so much for the territory it secured as for what it triggered across the Atlantic, because the stunning American success persuaded France that the rebels might actually be capable of winning, and a France looking for any opportunity to humiliate its old rival Britain decided the time had come to enter the war on the American side. That French alliance would prove absolutely decisive. The French alliance is impossible to overstate, by the way. The Americans were a collection of squabbling colonies with an underfunded army and a chronic shortage of everything, taking on the foremost military and naval power in the world. Without the money, the ships, the troops, and the credibility that France brought to the table, the odds of the revolution succeeding would have been grim indeed. Saratoga did not just win a battle, it bought an ally, and that ally would, in time, help make independence possible. Alexander played a part in the delicate aftermath of Saratoga, and it was a thankless one. The general who had commanded the victorious Northern Army, Horatio Gates, was enjoying his sudden fame enormously, and was not especially eager to share his hard-won troops with Washington, who urgently needed reinforcements. Washington dispatched Alexander on a tricky diplomatic mission to persuade Gates to part with some of his soldiers, which meant sending a young aide to go and extract troops from a puffed-up, newly famous general who had every intention of keeping them. It was an assignment requiring tact, firmness, and the ability to navigate a prickly ego, and Alexander handled the awkward business with a maturity well beyond his years, securing reinforcements while managing not to start a feud that would have done the cause no favours. It was another quiet demonstration that the young man could be trusted with delicate high-stakes matters. Then came the winter that became a byword for suffering and endurance, the brutal encampment at Valley Forge. With Philadelphia in British hands, Washington's exhausted, half-starved, poorly clothed army hunkered down for a miserable winter, and the conditions were genuinely horrifying. Soldiers lacked proper shoes, blankets, and food, disease swept through the camp, and the army very nearly disintegrated from sheer hardship before the spring ever arrived. It was, by any reasonable standard, an army on the brink of collapse, and yet, out of that misery came one of the most important transformations of the war, because it was at Valley Forge that the ragged American forces were finally drilled into something resembling a professional army. The man responsible for this transformation was a Prussian military officer who went by the grand title of Baron von Steuben, a veteran of the disciplined armies of Europe who arrived to whip the Americans into shape. There was, however, one small logistical complication. The Baron's English was essentially non-existent. He could bark drill commands and curse with great enthusiasm, but communicating his sophisticated training methods and rewriting the army's entire system of drill and discipline required someone who could bridge the language gap. And this is where Alexander's old education came back to serve him in a way no one could have predicted. The French he had learned as a child from his mother, on a small Caribbean island, in a household that the respectable world had turned its back on, now made him invaluable, because von Steuben could work in French, and Alexander could translate it into orders and manuals the American officers could actually use. The same language skill that had once been a quaint accomplishment of an illegitimate boy was now helping to professionalize the army of a revolution. History has a wonderful sense of timing like that. When the army finally emerged from Valley Forge in the spring, it was a genuinely different and more capable force, and it got its chance to prove it at the Battle of Monmouth on the 28th of June in 1778. Monmouth was a sprawling, chaotic, brutally hot battle, fought in summer temperatures so punishing that men on both sides collapsed from the heat alone, which is not the sort of detail that makes it into the heroic paintings. The battle is also famous for a near disaster caused by one of Washington's own senior commanders, General Charles Lee. Lee, who had been ordered to attack the rear of the retreating British column, instead bungled the assault badly and ordered a confused, unauthorized retreat that threatened to turn the whole engagement into a rout. This is where Alexander, never one to stay calmly behind a desk when there was a crisis unfolding, threw himself into the chaos. As the retreat threatened to collapse into panic, he rode straight into the disorder and personally worked to rally the faltering troops, helping to halt a fleeing brigade and steady the line at a moment when everything hung in the balance. In the thick of it, his horse was shot out from under him, killed by enemy fire, and Alexander went down hard, taking a fall that left him injured and shaken. It was the kind of reckless physical courage that he displayed again and again, the willingness to put his own body directly in harm's way that sat somewhat at odds with his role as a brilliant administrator and writer. The man could draft a flawless letter and then go get a horse killed under him in the same week. Washington himself arrived on the field at the critical moment, furiously confronted Lee, and personally took command, rallying the army and turning a near catastrophe into a respectable, showing that proved the men of Valley Forge could now stand toe-to-toe with British regulars. As for General Lee, his behaviour at Monmouth ended his career. Alexander, who had witnessed the debacle up close and was thoroughly disgusted by it, played a part in the aftermath, supporting the move to arrest Lee for his conduct and later testifying against him at the court-martial that followed. Lee was found guilty and effectively finished as a commander, and Alexander had once again demonstrated his willingness to confront powerful men when he believed they had failed the cause, regardless of the awkwardness involved. There is one more episode from these years that deserves its place, because it reveals a side of Alexander that sets him apart from many of his celebrated contemporaries and connects directly back to the world he came from. Remember that he had grown up surrounded by the machinery of slavery, watching its cruelty up close, and that the experience had left him with a deep and lasting opposition to it. During the war, Alexander, together with his close friend John Laurens, became an advocate for a genuinely radical proposal. They championed a plan to recruit enslaved black men into the army as soldiers, offering them their freedom in exchange for their service. Alexander put the case to Congress directly, arguing for the formation of regiments of up to several thousand black soldiers who would fight for the American cause and earn their liberty by doing so. It was a proposal that combined practical military logic, the army desperately needed men, with a moral argument that cut straight against the foundations of the society many of the founders were fighting to build. Alexander argued, with characteristic clarity, that the men in question were every bit as capable of becoming good soldiers as anyone else, and that the prospect of freedom would make them fight all the harder. It was an idea well ahead of its time, and predictably it ran straight into a wall. The plantation owners of the southern colonies, whose entire economy and way of life rested on enslaved labour, blocked the proposal cold. The notion of arming enslaved men and granting them freedom was, to them, not a clever wartime measure, but an existential threat to everything they were built on, and they killed it. The plan went nowhere, defeated by the very interest that the contradictions of the young nation were already setting in motion. But the episode stands as a marker of where Alexander's convictions lay, and a reminder that the orphan from the Sugar Island had carried something important away from that brutal place, a refusal to simply accept the cruelty he had grown up watching as the natural order of things. By the close of this period, Alexander Hamilton was no longer the unknown immigrant who had stunned a crowd with a surprise speech. He was a trusted officer at the very centre of the revolution, a brilliant writer who served as the indispensable right hand of the most important man in America, a soldier who had repeatedly proven his courage under fire, and a young man with friendships, convictions and ambitions that were only growing larger. He had absorbed an education in war, administration and statecraft that no university on earth could have offered, and yet, for all his importance, he was growing restless, because the role of the brilliant aide, the man behind the great man, was beginning to chafe against the fierce desire for glory and independence that had driven him since he was a penniless boy dreaming of escape. The pen had carried him to the heart of power. But Alexander wanted more than to be the voice behind the commander. He wanted a name and a moment that were unmistakably, undeniably his own, and getting it would take everything he had. As it happened, the next great turning point in Alexander's life did not arrive on a battlefield at all, which must have been mildly irritating for a man so desperate to win glory by the sword. It arrived in a drafty winter encampment in the form of a young woman, and it would prove every bit as consequential as any cannon he ever fired. The army had settled into its grim winter quarters at Morristown, a season of cold, boredom, and the eternal shortage of supplies that defined the entire war, and into that bleak setting walked the daughter of one of the most powerful families in New York. Her name was Elizabeth Schuyler, Eliza to those who knew her, and on the 2nd of February in 1780 she crossed paths with the brilliant young aide who had been hovering at the centre of the revolution for years. Eliza was the daughter of General Philip Schuyler, a man of enormous wealth and influence whose family sat near the very top of New York society, the kind of family that owned vast estates, moved in the higher circles, and generally got to decide who mattered and who did not. For an illegitimate orphan from a Caribbean sugar island, courting into a family like that was, on paper, an almost laughable ambition. In practice, Alexander pulled it off with the same relentless charm and intensity he applied to everything, and Eliza, by all accounts, was thoroughly taken with him. The courtship moved at a pace that would give a modern dating app whiplash. They met in early February, and by the end of March they were engaged. Now it would be easy and a little cynical to assume that Alexander, ever the strategist, was simply marrying into money and connections, and there is no question that the match was advantageous in exactly that way. But the surviving letters between the two of them make a more romantic case. Alexander wrote to Eliza with a tenderness and devotion that does not read like calculation, and the marriage, for all its practical benefits, appears to have been a genuine love match. The two were wed on the 14th of December in 1780 at the Grand Schuyler mansion, and Alexander found himself almost overnight transformed from a brilliant but penniless outsider into a member of one of America's leading families. It is worth pausing on Eliza herself because she's too often reduced to a footnote in her husband's much louder story, and that is a disservice to a genuinely remarkable woman. She was steady where Alexander was volatile, patient where he was impulsive, and possessed of a quiet strength that would be tested again and again over the coming decades in ways no one could yet imagine. She was not the dazzling society beauty of legend by her own family's account, but she was warm, intelligent, deeply principled and devoted, and she would prove to be the emotional anchor of a man whose brilliance came bundled with a restless, sometimes self-destructive intensity. In marrying her, Alexander gained far more than connections. He gained a partner who would stand by him through triumphs and humiliations alike, and who would, long after he was gone, dedicate the rest of her own long life to protecting his legacy. But all of that lay in the future. For now, the penniless orphan had married into the heart of the American aristocracy, and the improbability of it would have made his younger self laugh out loud. This was not a small thing, and it is worth dwelling on, because it changed his entire position in the world. For years, Alexander's standing had depended almost entirely on the favour of General Washington. He was the great man's indispensable aide, but he was still, fundamentally, a dependent, a talented young man whose place rested on the patronage of someone more powerful. Marrying into the Schuyler family gave him something he had never had in his life, a base of his own, a foothold in society, wealth and connections that were not borrowed from anyone. It loosened the cord that had tied his fortune so completely to Washington's goodwill, and for a man as fiercely independent and ambitious as Alexander, that newfound footing mattered enormously. He was no longer merely the orphan who had been generously taken in. He was Alexander Hamilton, son-in-law of General Schuyler, a man with a name that now opened doors instead of slamming them. But the marriage and the comfortable new connections did nothing to cool the burning ambition that had defined him since boyhood. If anything, they sharpened it, because Alexander still did not have the one thing he wanted most, which was a moment of unmistakable martial glory that belonged entirely to him. For 4 long years he had served as Washington's aide, doing the indispensable invisible work of running the war from behind the scenes, and the whole time a part of him had been quietly chafing, longing for the chance to lead men into battle and win the kind of honour that everyone could see. Being the brilliant pen behind the commander was a position of immense importance, but it was not glamorous, and Alexander, let us be honest, very much wanted the glamour. The frustration finally came to a head in 1781, and it nearly ended his relationship with Washington altogether. The two men had a falling out, a sharp exchange over what Alexander felt was a slight to his dignity, sparked by something almost comically minor, a moment when Washington reproached him for keeping the general waiting on a staircase. To most people this would have been a forgettable bit of workplace friction. To the proud, touchy Alexander, it was an insult to his honour, and honour was a thing he took with deadly seriousness, a trait that would, decades later, prove to have tragic consequences. Never one to swallow a perceived insult, he resigned from his position as aide. It was a risky, prideful move, walking away from the heart of power over a matter of wounded honour, but it also freed him to pursue the field command he had been craving. And pursue it he did, relentlessly, badgering Washington for a combat assignment with the persistence of a man who would not take no for an answer. Eventually, in July of 1781, after Alexander essentially made it clear that he would rather leave the army entirely than be denied, Washington relented and gave him what he wanted, a command in the field at the head of a battalion of light infantry. The pen had finally been traded for the sword, at least temporarily, and the timing could not have been better because the war was hurtling toward its decisive climax. That climax was the siege of Yorktown, and it is here that Alexander got the shining moment of glory he had been chasing for his entire adult life. By the autumn of 1781, the combined American and French forces had cornered a major British army, commanded by General Cornwallis, at the coastal town of Yorktown in Virginia. The situation for the British was rapidly becoming hopeless. They were hemmed in, with water on several sides and the Allied armies tightening around them on land, where Alexander's old friend Lafayette had played a key role in pinning the British in place. A French fleet had taken control of the sea, cutting off any hope of escape or rescue by water, which was a polite way of saying Cornwallis was thoroughly trapped. The Allied forces began a formal siege, digging trenches, hauling up artillery, and methodically closing in on the British defences. Siege warfare in this era was a slow, grinding, deeply unglamorous business, all digging and waiting and inching forward under fire, the kind of patient, methodical work that does not make for thrilling paintings but wins wars all the same. The attackers would dig a trench parallel to the enemy's lines, drag their cannons up, pound the defences, and then dig the next trench a little closer, repeating the process until they were near enough to storm the works directly. It was exhausting and dangerous, and required enormous discipline, and for a man as impatient as Alexander, the slow choreography of it must have been a special kind of torture. But the noose was tightening, and everyone on both sides could see how it was going to end. The British position was protected by a series of fortified strongpoints, and two of them, stubborn little fortresses known as redoubts, stood in the way of the final Allied advance. Taking them was essential, and the assault was planned for the night of the 14th of October in 1781. The French were assigned to storm one of the redoubts, and the Americans were to take the other, the one designated Redoubt No. 10, and the man chosen to lead the American assault after he lobbied hard for the honour was Alexander Hamilton. This was the moment, and Alexander knew it. Under the cover of darkness, he led his column of Continental soldiers forward in a daring bayonet assault. To preserve surprise and avoid alerting the defenders with gunfire, the attackers went in with unloaded muskets, relying on the bayonet alone, which takes a particular kind of nerve, charging a fortified position in the dark armed essentially with very long knives and the hope that everything goes faster than the enemy can react. It did. The assault was swift, fierce, and astonishingly successful. Alexander's men swarmed over the defences and seized the redoubt in roughly 10 minutes, a stunningly quick and effective action that captured the strong point with relatively light losses. The young man who had dreamed of military glory since he was a clerk balancing ledgers had just led one of the most celebrated assaults of the entire Revolution, and he had done it brilliantly. With the redoubts taken, the Allied artillery could now pound the British position into submission, and Cornwallis, his situation utterly hopeless, recognised that further resistance was pointless. On the 17th of October in 1781 he surrendered his army. The surrender at Yorktown was the effective end of the Revolutionary War. There would be more skirmishes and a long wait for the formal peace treaty, but the back of the British war effort had been broken, and American independence, the cause that had seemed so improbable for so long, was now essentially won. Alexander had been there for the decisive blow, not in the background drafting letters, but at the front of the charge, exactly where he had always wanted to be. He had earned his glory, and he had earned it in the most important battle of the war. There was personal happiness in this period too, mixed in with the triumph. In January of 1782, Eliza gave birth to the couple's first child, a son they named Philip, the first of what would eventually be 8 children. The orphan who had grown up without a stable family of his own was now building one, and a large one at that, with a wife from a powerful family and a growing brood of children. After a childhood defined by loss and abandonment, there was something quietly profound about Alexander, of all people, becoming the patriarch of a sprawling household. The man who had once owned almost nothing and belonged to no one now had a family, a name, and a future. But this chapter cannot end on a happy note, because the war that was winding down still had one more cruel blow to deliver, and it struck at one of the people Alexander loved most. His dear friend John Laurens, the idealistic, courageous young man who had been his closest companion through the war and his ally in the failed effort to recruit and free enslaved soldiers, was still in the field, still fighting, even as the conflict sputtered toward its conclusion. And in August of 1782, in one of the last, almost pointless skirmishes of a war that was already decided, John Laurens was killed. It was a senseless, heartbreaking loss, the kind of death that feels especially bitter precisely because it came when the great struggle was all but over and there was so little left to fight for. Alexander was devastated. He had lost the friend who understood him best, a brother in everything but blood, in a meaningless clash at the very end of a war they had both helped to win. The triumph of independence for Alexander would always carry that shadow with it, the knowledge that the friend who should have shared in it did not live to see it. With the fighting effectively over, Alexander turned, as he always did, to the next mountain to climb, and he climbed it at a speed that frankly seems unfair to everyone else who has ever studied for an exam. He decided to become a lawyer, which in normal circumstances required a lengthy period of study and apprenticeship. Alexander, naturally, was not interested in normal circumstances. He crammed the entire body of legal knowledge required to pass the bar into roughly 6 months of furious self-study, mastering in half a year what took most aspiring lawyers years of patient preparation. By the end of it, he had passed the examination and qualified to practice law in New York, adding another formidable skill to a resume that was already getting absurd. The man simply could not encounter a difficult subject without devouring it whole. He turned out to be a formidable lawyer too, not merely a competent one. In the courtroom he was relentless, meticulously prepared, and capable of holding forth at extraordinary length, marshalling fact and argument with a thoroughness that wore opponents down through sheer force of preparation. Clients quickly learned that hiring Alexander Hamilton meant hiring a man who would master every detail of their case, and then some, and who would argue it with the same intensity he brought to everything else in his life. It was a lucrative practice, and for the first time he was earning a comfortable living through his own efforts, rather than relying on connections or patronage, which suited his fierce independence nicely. The lawyer's income would matter, because Alexander, despite handling the finances of an entire nation, was never especially good at managing his own, a small irony that would follow him throughout his life. In November of 1782, even as he was establishing his legal career, Alexander took a seat representing New York in the Congress of the Confederation, the governing body of the newly independent states, and here, almost immediately, he ran headlong into the great problem that would consume the next phase of his life and shape his entire political vision. The new nation, having just won its independence, was being governed under a system that was, to put it charitably, a complete mess. The states had bound themselves together loosely, under an arrangement that gave the central government almost no real power, on the very understandable but ultimately disastrous theory that after fighting a war against an overbearing central authority in London, the last thing anyone wanted was a strong central authority of their own. The result was a national government that was essentially powerless. It could not levy taxes on its own. It could not reliably raise money. It could not enforce its decisions, regulate trade between the states, or pay its own debts, including the debts it owed to the very soldiers who had won the war and to the foreign allies who had helped fund it. It was, in practical terms, a government in name only, a feeble committee that could politely request things from 13 squabbling states and then watch helplessly as the states ignored it. For a man like Alexander, who had spent the entire war watching the cause nearly collapse for lack of money and central coordination, this arrangement was not just inefficient, it was dangerous, an invitation to chaos, foreign meddling, and eventual collapse. The debt problem in particular kept Alexander awake at night, and not without reason. The young nation had borrowed enormous sums to fight its war for independence, from its own citizens and from foreign governments, and now it was proving utterly incapable of paying any of it back. A country that does not pay its debts, as Alexander understood with a clarity that escaped most of his contemporaries, is a country no one will ever lend to again, and a country that cannot borrow is a country that cannot survive a crisis. The states each guarded their own purses jealously, and felt little obligation to fund the shared burdens of the Union, with the predictable result that the Union's credit was, to put it gently, in the gutter. This was not an abstract accounting problem to Alexander. It was a matter of national life and death, and the fact that so few people seemed to grasp it only deepened his sense of urgency. So Alexander became, almost from the moment he entered Congress, a passionate and tireless advocate for a strong central government, one with real powers to tax, to raise money, to regulate commerce, and to actually function as the government of a real nation rather than a polite suggestion box. He found an ally in this cause in James Madison, a brilliant, soft-spoken Virginian who shared, at least for the moment, his conviction that the existing system was hopelessly broken. The two of them worked together to push reforms, and Alexander supported Madison's proposal for a modest federal duty, a 5% tax on imports, which would have given the central government its own reliable source of revenue. It was a sensible, limited measure. Naturally, it failed, because under the existing rules such changes required the agreement of all the states, and getting all 13 states to agree on anything was roughly as easy as herding a barnful of cats while blindfolded. If Alexander needed any further proof of how dangerously weak the central government had become, he got it in the most vivid way possible in June of 1783. A group of disgruntled soldiers, angry over unpaid wages, which was an entirely legitimate grievance given that the government was hopeless at paying anyone, surrounded the building where Congress was meeting and effectively held the lawmakers hostage with their protest. And the central government, faced with a mob of its own veterans at its doorstep, could do absolutely nothing, because it had no force of its own to call upon, and the local authorities declined to intervene. The Congress of the United States was reduced to fleeing the city to escape its own unpaid army. For Alexander, this humiliating episode was a perfect, infuriating illustration of his entire argument. A government that could not even protect itself, that had to run away from a crowd of its own soldiers, was no government at all. It would be hard to design a more damning advertisement for the need for reform if you tried. The experience only hardened his determination to build something far stronger in its place. In the meantime, Alexander threw himself into his new legal career, and here he demonstrated yet again the principled streak that ran through his character, the same instinct that had once led him to protect a man whose politics he despised. In the bitter aftermath of the war, there was enormous popular anger directed at the Loyalists, the Americans who had sided with Britain during the conflict. Mobs and legislatures alike wanted to punish them, strip them of their property, and drive them out, and standing up for the rights of these deeply unpopular people was about as politically toxic as it got. Alexander, characteristically, did it anyway. He took on legal cases defending the rights of Loyalists, including a famous case known as Rutgers versus Waddington in 1784. The case involved a dispute over property, but Alexander used it to make a far larger and more daring argument. He contended that the peace treaty the United States had signed with Britain, an international agreement, took precedence over a conflicting law passed by the state of New York. In other words, he argued that a national treaty obligation was superior to state legislation, a principle that struck directly at the idea that each state could simply do as it pleased regardless of national commitments. This was explosive stuff, and in the heated atmosphere of the time, defending Loyalists and elevating treaties over state law was the kind of position that could get a man accused of betraying his own country. Alexander risked exactly such accusations, but he believed deeply in the principle that a nation had to honour its agreements, and that the rule of law had to stand above the passions of the moment. It was both a legal argument and a preview of his vision for the country, one in which national authority and the sanctity of law would tame the chaos of competing state interests. Alexander was also busy building institutions, not just arguing about them. In June of 1784, he founded the Bank of New York, one of the earliest banks in the country, an enterprise that put his deep understanding of finance to practical use and reflected his conviction that a modern nation needed sophisticated financial machinery to thrive. To a lot of Americans at the time, banks were objects of deep suspicion, mysterious contraptions that seemed to conjure money out of nothing and concentrate it in the hands of a shadowy few. Alexander saw them very differently, as engines of credit and growth that could mobilize capital, finance enterprise, and give a young economy the fuel it needed to develop. The Bank of New York would go on to become one of the longest-lived financial institutions in the country, an early proof of the ideas about money and credit that he had been refining since his days tracking ships and converting currencies as a teenage clerk. And true to the convictions he had carried since his Caribbean childhood, he was also active in the New York Manumission Society, an organization dedicated to fighting against slavery and working toward its end. It is one of the more admirable consistencies of his life that, surrounded as he was by founders who spoke eloquently of liberty while owning human beings, Alexander put real effort into the cause of abolition, lending his name and energy to the slow, difficult work of chipping away at an institution he had despised since he was a boy watching its cruelties firsthand. The society pushed for gradual emancipation, supported legal protections for free black New Yorkers, and worked against the kidnapping of free people into bondage, unglamorous and incremental work that rarely made headlines, but mattered enormously to the people it helped. It was not a perfect record, and the contradictions of the era touched nearly everyone in some fashion. But among the leading figures of the founding generation, Alexander stood notably closer to the side of abolition than most, and he got there honestly, by way of a childhood that had shown him exactly what the system was. But all of this, the law, the bank, the abolition work, was happening against the backdrop of his central obsession, the desperate need to fix the broken national government before it dragged the whole experiment in independence down with it. By the mid-1780s, a growing number of influential Americans had come to share his alarm, and momentum was building for serious reform. A meeting was called in Annapolis in September of 1786, ostensibly to discuss problems of interstate trade, but the advocates of a stronger union, Alexander very much among them, seized on it as an opportunity. The Annapolis meeting itself accomplished little in terms of trade, having been poorly attended, but the reformers turned it to their advantage by using it to issue a call for something much bigger, a full convention of all the states to meet in Philadelphia and address the fundamental flaws in the national government. It was a clever piece of political maneuvering, transforming a minor and somewhat disappointing trade conference into the launchpad for a complete overhaul of American government. That convention opened in Philadelphia on the 25th of May in 1787, and it would become one of the most consequential gatherings in human history, the meeting that produced the United States Constitution. The convention was conducted in almost total secrecy, the delegates having agreed to keep the windows shut and the proceedings confidential so they could argue, bargain, and change their minds without the entire country looking over their shoulders. This meant the gentleman tasked with redesigning the government spent a sweltering Philadelphia summer, locked in a stuffy room with the windows closed, debating the future of a nation while quietly roasting, which may explain some of the compromises. The secrecy served a real purpose, allowing for the kind of frank negotiation that would have been impossible under public scrutiny. But it also meant that one of the foundational events of American history happened entirely behind closed doors, its details emerging only later. Into this hot, secretive, high-stakes environment stepped Alexander, ready as ever to share his opinions, of which he had a great many. Alexander was there as a delegate, but his role in the convention itself turned out to be a curious mixture of brilliance and political miscalculation. Because when the time came for Alexander to lay out his own vision for what the new government should look like, he went big. Possibly too big. He delivered a lengthy speech proposing a remarkably bold and centralized plan, one that called for an extraordinarily powerful national government. Among its features were a president and a senate who would serve not for fixed terms but for life, or close to it, holding their offices for as long as they behaved themselves. To Alexander, this was simple logic. He had spent years watching weak, unstable, short-term government nearly destroy everything, and he genuinely believed that strength, stability, and permanence were what a young nation needed to survive in a dangerous world. To many of his fellow delegates, however, the plan sounded alarmingly like a recipe for an elected monarchy, a betrayal of the very revolution they had just fought. The proposal landed with a thud, and it earned Alexander a reputation, fair or not, as a closet monarchist, a man secretly nostalgic for the kind of strong top-down rule the colonies had just thrown off. The label would dog him for the rest of his career, weaponized endlessly by his political enemies, and it stemmed in large part from this single dramatic speech. His plan went nowhere, which was probably for the best, but it left a lasting stain on his reputation in the eyes of those inclined to distrust him. Here is the thing, though. and it is the part that often gets lost in the story of his overreaching speech. Even though Alexander's specific plan was rejected, and even though he was sometimes absent from the convention during its long months of negotiation, he remained a committed and influential figure in the larger project. When the convention finally hammered out its compromises and produced a draft, Alexander served on the committee responsible for refining the language and giving the constitution its final form, lending his considerable skill with words to the polishing of the document that would govern the nation. And crucially, when it came time to sign, Alexander signed it. He did so despite serious reservations, because in his judgment a strong, imperfect constitution was infinitely better than the feeble chaos of the existing system. He was the only delegate from New York to put his name to the document, his fellow New York delegates having stormed off in opposition, which meant that Alexander, somewhat awkwardly, signed on behalf of a state whose other representatives wanted nothing to do with the thing. Among the compromises Alexander swallowed in order to support the Constitution was one that sits as a permanent moral stain on the founding of the nation, the arrangement commonly known as the 3/5 Compromise. This was the deeply troubling formula by which enslaved people, who had no rights and no freedom whatsoever, were nonetheless counted as 3/5 of a person for the purpose of determining how many representatives each state would have in the new government. The effect was to inflate the political power of the slaveholding states, rewarding them in the halls of government for the very system of bondage that men like Alexander opposed. It was a grim bargain, struck to hold the fragile union together by appeasing the southern states whose entire economy rested on enslaved labor, and it baked the contradictions of slavery directly into the foundations of the new republic. Alexander, who had fought against slavery and would continue to, accepted it as the price of getting a functioning national government at all, a compromise he found distasteful but judged necessary. It is one of those moments that captures the painful contradictions at the heart of the American founding, a nation conceived in the language of liberty while making cold accommodations with its opposite. History rarely arrives clean, and the founding was no exception. So as this period drew to a close, Alexander Hamilton had travelled an extraordinary distance from where he had begun the decade. He had married into power, won his long-craved military glory at the head of a daring charge, started a family, mastered the law in record time, built a bank, fought for the rights of the unpopular and the enslaved alike, and helped bring into being the framework of a new government. He had also made enemies, earned a reputation as a dangerous centralizer, and watched his closest friend die in a meaningless skirmish. But the constitution he had signed, for all his reservations about it, was not yet the law of the land. It was merely a proposal, a piece of parchment that meant nothing unless the states could be persuaded to accept it, and persuading a deeply sceptical, fiercely independent collection of states to surrender their power to a strong new national government was going to be the fight of his life, a battle to be waged not with cannons or bayonets, but with the one weapon Alexander Hamilton had always wielded better than almost anyone alive. The pen was about to be called back into service, and the future of the entire nation would hang on the words that flowed from it. A signed constitution, as Alexander understood better than almost anyone, was nothing more than a very expensive piece of paper unless the states could be convinced to actually adopt it. The document produced in Philadelphia had to be ratified, approved by special conventions in the individual states, and the moment it became public, it ran into a wall of fierce, organized, deeply felt opposition. A great many Americans took one look at the proposed national government, with its powers to tax and to command and to override the states, and saw not salvation, but a brand new tyranny dressed up in Republican clothing. They had just fought a long and bloody war to get out from under a distant, powerful central authority, and here came a group of gentlemen proposing to build them a new one, complete with the power to reach into their pockets. You can understand why they were sceptical, and you can understand why the argument that followed was as heated as anything the young country had yet produced. These opponents came to be known as the anti-federalists, and they were not cranks or fools. They included serious, respected, principled people who genuinely feared that the new constitution would crush the liberties of ordinary citizens and the independence of the states, concentrating dangerous power in a faraway capital among a small elite. Their concerns were real, their arguments were often sharp, and in several of the most important states they commanded majority support. One of their most effective objections, and the one that proved hardest to answer, was that the proposed constitution contained no explicit list of protected rights for individuals, no written guarantees of freedoms like speech, religion, or trial by jury. If the new government was going to be so powerful, the anti-federalists asked, what exactly was stopping it from trampling the basic liberties of the people? It was a genuinely strong point, and it would eventually force a crucial concession: the promise that a set of amendments protecting individual rights would be added to the document once it was adopted, a promise that produced what would become the Bill of Rights. The ratification of the Constitution was not the foregone conclusion that hindsight makes it appear. It was a genuine white-knuckle contest, and for a while it looked like it could go either way. The whole grand project of a stronger union might simply collapse before it ever got started, voted down state by state. Alexander, faced with this, did what Alexander always did when confronted with a seemingly impossible challenge. He reached for his pen, and then he reached for it again, and again, and again, with a stamina that bordered on the superhuman. He conceived of an ambitious plan, a sustained campaign of persuasion unlike anything that had been attempted before, a series of essays that would explain, defend, and argue for the new constitution in such thorough and compelling detail that they would win over the doubters and arm the supporters with everything they needed to make the case. It was, in essence, the largest and most concentrated effort of public persuasion the young country had ever seen, an attempt to talk an entire population into a new form of government, one carefully reasoned argument at a time. The essays would be published in newspapers, where they could reach a wide audience, and they would all appear under a single shared pseudonym. That pseudonym was Publius, a name chosen with deliberate care, as these things tended to be in an age when educated men reached for ancient Rome the way modern people reach for their phones. Publius was a reference to a figure from the early days of the Roman Republic, a statesman remembered as a founder and defender of republican government, exactly the image the authors wished to evoke. Writing under a single classical pen name also served a practical purpose. It allowed the essays to speak with one unified voice, presenting a seamless argument rather than a collection of individual opinions, and it provided a measure of anonymity in an age when political writing was often done under such disguises. Of course, the anonymity was the worst-kept secret in New York, since not many people could produce that volume and quality of political argument, but the convention was observed all the same. The plan, however, required collaborators, because even Alexander Hamilton could not write an entire library of political philosophy on his own, while also practicing law and tending to his growing family, though one suspects he briefly considered trying. He reached out to several men he hoped would join the project, and most of them, sensibly recognizing the staggering amount of labor involved, declined. A couple of would-be contributors started and quickly thought better of it once they grasped the relentless pace the project would demand, which is an entirely understandable reaction to being asked to help produce dozens of essays on a punishing schedule. In the end, only 2 agreed to take up the burden alongside him, and fortunately for the future of the country, both were exceptional. The first was James Madison, the brilliant Virginian who had been Alexander's ally in the fight for a stronger union, and who possessed one of the most penetrating political minds of his generation. Madison was small, quiet, scholarly, and physically frail, the kind of man who looked like he might blow away in a strong wind, but his intellect was formidable, and his understanding of political theory and the practical mechanics of government was second to none. He had been a central architect of the Constitution itself, which made him uniquely qualified to defend it. The partnership between Alexander and Madison on this project was one of the great intellectual collaborations in history, which makes it all the more striking, and a little sad, that these 2 men would later become bitter political enemies, their alliance dissolving into one of the fiercest rivalries of the early Republic. The 2 could hardly have been more different in temperament, the brash, fiery, open-handed Alexander beside the reserved, cautious, meticulous Madison, and yet for a season their gifts fit together perfectly, each supplying what the other lacked. But that lay in the future. For now, they were comrades in a common cause. The second collaborator was John Jay, a distinguished New York lawyer, diplomat, and statesman of considerable reputation and experience. Jay was older and more established than Alexander, a respected figure who brought gravity and credibility to the enterprise, with deep expertise in foreign affairs and the workings of diplomacy. He would later become the first Chief Justice of the United States, which gives you a sense of his standing. Jay had spent years in the thankless world of wartime and post-war diplomacy, negotiating with European powers on behalf of a young nation that had little money and even less leverage, an experience that gave him a hard-headed understanding of how dangerous the world was for a weak and divided country, which made him a natural ally in arguing for a stronger union. Jay was meant to be a full partner in the writing, but fate intervened in the form of illness. He fell seriously ill partway through the project and was largely sidelined, which dramatically limited the number of essays he was able to contribute. It was nobody's fault, but it did mean the bulk of the workload fell on the remaining two, and especially on Alexander. What these three men accomplished over the following 7 months is, frankly, difficult to comprehend. Working at a furious pace, often against tight deadlines as the essays were published in installments in the newspapers, they produced a body of work that ran to around 600 pages, comprising 85 separate essays. 85 of substantial, densely argued political philosophy in 7 months, while also, in Alexander's case, running a busy law practice and, in Madison's case, being deeply involved in the actual political manoeuvring of ratification. The output is almost absurd by any normal standard of human productivity. Most people would struggle to write 85 thoughtful emails in 7 months, let alone 85 enduring essays on the theory and structure of constitutional government. The division of labour, as best historians have been able to determine, tells its own story about who was carrying the load. Of the 85 essays, around 51 are attributed to Alexander, roughly 29 to Madison, and only about 5 to Jay, whose illness kept his contribution small. In other words, Alexander wrote well over half of the entire collection, an output that is staggering even by his own remarkable standards. He was, as ever, the engine of the project, churning out essay after essay, with a speed and consistency that left observers shaking their heads. The man wrote the way other people breathe. It is the kind of productivity that makes you wonder whether he ever slept, and the honest answer is, probably not much. The pace at which they worked is worth dwelling on, because it explains both the brilliance and the occasional roughness of the essays. The pieces were published in the New York newspapers at a relentless clip, sometimes several in a single week, each one snapped up by readers and reprinted elsewhere. This meant the authors were perpetually racing a printer's deadline, dashing off arguments of lasting philosophical weight, under the kind of time pressure that would make a modern columnist weep. There is a much-loved tradition that Alexander composed some of his essays in snatched moments between legal appointments and even while travelling, scribbling away wherever he happened to find himself, which is the 18th century equivalent of writing a doctoral thesis on your phone during the commute. Whether or not every detail of that legend holds up, the broader truth is undeniable. These were not leisurely meditations. They were produced at a sprint by men with 100 other obligations, in the middle of a political emergency, and the wonder is not that a few of them feel hurried, but that so many of them turned out to be timeless. These essays, collected together, became known as the Federalist Papers, and they would go on to become one of the most important works of political thought ever produced in the English language, studied and cited for centuries afterward, including, rather usefully, by the very courts tasked with interpreting the Constitution they defended. But it is important to remember what they actually were at the time of their writing. They were not lofty academic treatises composed in tranquil retirement. They were urgent, hard-hitting pieces of political persuasion, written in the heat of a real and pressing fight, designed to win votes and change minds in a contest whose outcome was very much in doubt. They just happened to be so brilliantly reasoned and so deeply considered that they transcended their immediate purpose and became timeless. In them, Alexander drew on everything he had learned across a life crammed with hard experience. He drew on his years at the centre of the war, on his intimate knowledge of how the feeble existing government had repeatedly failed, on his deep understanding of finance and taxation, and on his wide reading in history and political philosophy. His central argument, hammered home from a dozen angles, was that a weak confederation of squabbling states was a path to disaster. Such a feeble arrangement, he warned, would inevitably lead either to internal chaos and the rise of tyranny from within, as desperate people turned to a strong man to impose order, or to conquest from without, as foreign powers picked off a divided and defenceless collection of states one by one. Only a strong, unified national government, he argued, could provide the stability, the security, and the prosperity that would allow the young nation to survive and flourish in a hostile world. The essays ranged across an enormous variety of subjects, each tackling a different aspect of the proposed government, and a different objection raised by its critics. Some addressed the dangers of factions and the ways a large republic could actually guard against them better than a small one, turning a common objection on its head. Some explained the system of checks and balances, the careful division of power among different branches so that no single part could grow strong enough to dominate the others, an idea drawn in part from the philosophers Alexander had absorbed in his college years. Some defended the powers of the presidency, arguing that a single, energetic executive was essential to good government and was not at all the same thing as a king, a point Alexander, forever shadowed by accusations of monarchism, was particularly keen to make. Others defended the role and independence of the courts, laying out a vision of the judiciary that would prove enormously influential in the centuries to come. Taken together, they amounted to a comprehensive point-by-point defence of the entire constitutional system, and a positive vision of what a well-constructed government could be. A few of the individual essays became so famous that they are still taught and quoted today, and it is worth pausing on what made them special, because they reveal the genuinely clever thinking behind the project. One of Madison's contributions tackled head-on the great fear that a large nation would be torn apart by competing factions and special interests. His insight, which was counterintuitive and rather brilliant, was that a large republic was actually safer from this danger than a small one, precisely because in a big, diverse country, there would be so many competing factions that no single one could easily seize control. The very size and variety that critics feared, he argued, were a source of stability rather than chaos. Another celebrated essay laid out the logic of dividing and balancing power, making the famous observation that since men are not angels, a government must be designed so that ambition is made to counteract ambition, with each part of the system jealously guarding its own turf and thereby checking the others. It was a clear-eyed, almost cynical view of human nature put to constructive use. The idea being that you build a good government not by assuming people will be virtuous, but by arranging things so that even selfish people end up keeping each other honest. Alexander's own most celebrated essays included a powerful defense of a strong, energetic presidency, in which he argued that decisiveness, speed, and accountability in a single executive were not threats to liberty, but essential ingredients of effective government, and that a feeble, divided executive would serve the nation poorly. He also wrote a landmark essay on the judiciary, in which he described the courts as the least dangerous branch, possessing neither the power of the purse nor the power of the sword, only judgment, and in which he laid out the case for judicial independence and the authority of courts to measure laws against the Constitution. That essay would echo through American legal history for centuries, shaping the very role the courts came to play. Even the opening essay of the whole collection, written by Alexander, set the stakes in sweeping terms, framing the choice before the country as nothing less than a test of whether human beings were truly capable of establishing good government through reflection and choice, or were doomed forever to have their political arrangements decided by accident and force. It was a grand, almost theatrical way to begin, and it announced from the very first lines that this was a debate about the future of self-government itself. The afterlife of these essays is its own quiet marvel. What began as urgent newspaper pieces meant to win a single political fight ended up outliving everyone who wrote them, and nearly everyone who first read them. In the centuries that followed, the collection became one of the most consulted guides to what the framers of the Constitution actually intended, picked up by judges, scholars, lawyers, and students trying to understand the meaning behind the document's spare and sometimes ambiguous language. There is a certain irony in the fact that essays churned out at breakneck speed to sway a few thousand voters became, over time, something close to a secondary scripture of American government, cited in the highest courts to settle disputes the authors could never have imagined. Alexander, who never lacked for confidence about the importance of his own work, would probably have found this entirely fitting and only mildly surprising. While the essays were being published and devoured by readers across the states, the actual battle for ratification was unfolding in the special conventions, and it was a grueling state-by-state slog. The rules required that 9 of the 13 states approve the Constitution for it to take effect, and the supporters had to win them one painful victory at a time. Some states came along relatively easily, persuaded by the arguments or already inclined toward a stronger union. Others were a brutal fight. By the end of May in 1788, 8 states had ratified the document, leaving the supporters tantalizingly close to the 9 they needed, but facing the hardest battles yet. And crucially, Two of the states still in play were among the most important in the entire country, Virginia and New York. Without those two, even a constitution that technically took effect would be a hollow thing, a national government missing some of its largest and most powerful members. A union without Virginia and New York would be a bit like a band reuniting without its lead singer and its drummer. Technically a band, but not one anyone takes seriously. This brings us to the convention in New York, which was Alexander's home ground, and which turned into the most dramatic confrontation of his political life to that point. The New York Convention gathered in June of 1788, and the situation Alexander faced there was genuinely dire. The delegates were heavily weighted against ratification. The Anti-Federalists held a clear majority, led by powerful and determined opponents of the Constitution, who had no intention of surrendering New York's independence to a strong national government. Chief among them was the state's own governor, George Clinton, a formidable and popular political operator who commanded deep loyalty across New York and who viewed the proposed national government as a direct threat to the state he led and the power he wielded within it. Going up against a sitting governor on his home turf, with the delegates already stacked against you, is the kind of fight most ambitious men would quietly find a reason to avoid. By a straightforward head count, the cause looked lost before it began. Alexander walked into that convention as the leading voice for a position that most of the people in the room actively opposed, which is not a position most politicians would relish. But Alexander was not most politicians, and what he did at the New York Convention became the stuff of legend. He fought, he argued, he spoke at extraordinary length day after day, marshalling every fact and principle and persuasive device at his command, working tirelessly to chip away at the opposition's certainty. By many accounts, he dominated the proceedings almost single-handedly, rising again and again to answer every objection, refute every argument, and wear down the resistance through sheer relentlessness, the same bottomless stamina that had once exhausted his college debating opponents, now deployed on the grandest possible stage. He could not win by votes, at least not at the start, so he set out to win by sheer force of argument and political manoeuvring, stalling, debating, and buying time, hoping that events elsewhere would shift the ground beneath the convention's feet. It was a high-wire act of political persistence, a one-man campaign to drag a hostile assembly toward a conclusion it did not want to reach, and it required him to keep the debate alive long enough for the wider world to do its work. And then events elsewhere did exactly what Alexander had been praying they would do. While the New York Convention was deadlocked, news arrived from outside that changed everything. New Hampshire ratified the Constitution, becoming the 9th state to do so, which meant that the Constitution would now legally take effect regardless of what New York decided. And then, even more importantly, came word that Virginia, the largest and most influential state of all, had also ratified after its own ferocious internal battle. Virginia's convention had been a clash of titans in its own right, with Madison defending the Constitution against the thunderous opposition of Patrick Henry, the famed orator whose voice could move a crowd like few others alive, and the fact that the quiet, soft-spoken Madison managed to prevail against such a formidable rival was a triumph in itself. This was the hammer blow. The arrival of these tidings transformed the entire calculation in the New York Convention. The question facing the New York delegates was no longer whether to join a risky new experiment. The experiment was happening with or without them. The question now was whether New York wanted to be inside this new union, with a voice and a vote and a share of the power, or stranded outside it, isolated and alone, a single state surrounded by a nation it had refused to join. That shift in circumstances, combined with Alexander's relentless campaign of persuasion, finally began to crack the opposition. Faced with the reality that the Constitution was now a fact and that standing outside it would leave New York dangerously isolated, enough delegates changed their minds or softened their resistance to tip the balance. On the 26th of July in 1788, the New York Convention voted to ratify the Constitution. The margin was razor-thin, just 30 votes in favour against 27 opposed, one of the closest calls of the entire ratification process. A handful of votes the other way, and the outcome would have been reversed. But a win is a win, and this one was enormous, securing the crucial state of New York for the new union and capping one of the most remarkable feats of political persuasion in American history. The news from those other states had not exactly arrived by leisurely post either. In an age before anything resembling instant communication, word of distant votes travelled by express riders, galloping their horses half to death along rough roads, racing to carry the latest results to the deadlocked New York Convention as fast as flesh and hoof could manage. The drama of it is easy to underappreciate from a modern vantage point, where election results arrive on a glowing screen within seconds. Back then, the fate of the largest experiment in self-government the world had seen could hinge on whether a mud-spattered rider made it to the convention hall a day sooner or later. Picture the delegates waiting, the tension thick in the room, and then the clatter of an exhausted horse outside and a messenger bursting in with the news that yet another state had fallen into line. It was political theatre of the highest order, and it was entirely real. The reaction in New York to the ratification was jubilant, and the city threw a celebration to match the moment. A grand procession marched through the streets, a parade of tradesmen, craftsmen, and citizens organised to honour the new constitution, and the centrepiece of it was a remarkable sight. A full model ship mounted on wheels and rolled through the streets, crewed by real sailors and fired with real little cannons, christened in honour of Alexander himself. To have a celebratory parade ship named after you, while you're still alive and barely into your 30s, is the sort of recognition most public figures never receive in a lifetime, and it captured just how central a role Alexander had played in the whole affair. The penniless immigrant had become in his adopted city a genuine hero. His name floated through the streets on a ship of celebration. Alexander was hailed as a hero for his role in the victory, and the celebration in New York was genuine and effusive. He had taken a hopeless position in a hostile room and, through a combination of brilliant argument, dogged persistence, and a little help from the timely actions of other states, turned it into triumph. The man who had arrived in the colonies as a penniless, illegitimate orphan from a distant island had now played a central role in securing the foundational document of the entire nation, both as its most prolific defender in print and as its most determined champion on the convention floor. It was the kind of vindication that even his soaring ambitions could scarcely have imagined, back in the days when he was balancing a sugar trader's books and dreaming of escape. With the Constitution ratified by the necessary states, the long, fragile process of actually building the new government could finally begin, and there was never any real question about who would lead it. The nation turned, as it always did in moments of decision, to George Washington. In the spring of 1789, Washington was elected as the first president of the United States, and the election was unanimous, every single elector casting a vote for him, a display of trust and unity that no subsequent president would ever match. Washington did not particularly want the job by most accounts, having hoped to retire quietly to his estate after a lifetime of service, but his sense of duty and the desperate need of the country pulled him back into public life one more time. On the 30th of April in 1789, he took the oath of office and became the first president, and the experiment in self-government that Alexander had fought so hard to secure was officially underway. Building a government from nothing was no small task, since there were no precedents to follow, no established departments, no civil service, no manuals explaining how any of it was supposed to work. Washington and the new Congress had to invent the executive branch more or less on the spot, creating the great departments and deciding who would run them. To head the State Department, responsible for foreign affairs, the choice fell on Thomas Jefferson, the eloquent Virginian and author of the Declaration of Independence, who at this moment was still abroad serving as the American representative in France and had been absent during the entire fight over the Constitution. That absence would matter, because when Jefferson returned and surveyed what had been built in his absence, he would not like much of it, and the collision between his vision of America and Alexander's was destined to become the defining political rivalry of the age. But all of that was still to come. For now, the new cabinet was being assembled, and the most consequential appointment of all was about to land on Alexander's desk. And then came the appointment that would define the rest of Alexander's life and cement his place in history. The new president needed to assemble a government, to create the great departments of the executive branch and fill them with capable men. Among the most important of these was the Treasury, the department that would handle the finances of the entire nation, a nation that was, as we have seen, drowning in debt and possessed of credit so poor that it could barely borrow a dollar. The country needed someone to take charge of its hopeless finances and somehow build a functioning system out of the wreckage, someone who understood money, credit, debt, banking, and the brutal practicalities of public finance at a level almost no one else in the country could match. There was really only one obvious candidate. In September of 1789, Washington appointed Alexander Hamilton as the first Secretary of the Treasury. It was the perfect job for the perfect man, the culmination of everything he had been preparing for, knowingly and unknowingly, since he was a teenage clerk tracking ships and converting currencies on a Caribbean island. All those years of bookkeeping, all that hard-won understanding of how money actually moved through the world, all his reading and his wartime experience watching the cause nearly perish for lack of funds, had led to this. The orphan who had once managed a single trading firm was now being handed the finances of an entire nation, a nation in desperate need of exactly the kind of genius he possessed. The scale of what he was inheriting is hard to overstate, and it was less a department than a catastrophe with a desk. There was a mountain of war debt owed both at home and abroad, a national credit so ruined that lenders regarded the young country as a hopeless risk, no reliable system for collecting revenue, no national currency worth the name, and no real financial machinery of any kind. Most people handed a mess like that would have quietly updated their will. Alexander, characteristically, saw not a disaster, but an opportunity, a blank slate on which he could design, more or less from first principles, the entire financial architecture of a modern nation. He was, depending on how you count, around 34 years old, and he was about to attempt one of the most audacious feats of statecraft in history, the construction, almost from scratch, of the financial foundations of the United States. The pen had won the battle for the Constitution. Now the same restless mind would turn to the task of building the machinery that would make the new nation actually work, and in doing so, Alexander Hamilton would shape the American economy in ways that endure to this very day. The first thing Alexander did upon taking charge of the Treasury was to look squarely at the size of the hole he was expected to fill, and the size of that hole was genuinely terrifying. The young nation was buried under a national debt of around $79 million, a sum that, in the money of the time, was so enormous as to be almost comical, except that nobody was laughing. This was money owed to foreign governments who had bankrolled the revolution, money owed to ordinary citizens and soldiers who had loaned the cause their savings and their service, and money owed in a tangle of state and national obligations so snarled that nobody had ever properly sorted out who owed what to whom. Untangling it would have given an accountant nightmares for a year. The country's credit was in ruins, its finances were a chaotic mess, and a great many sensible people quietly believed the debt was simply too large to ever be repaid, which is a polite way of saying they thought the United States was financially doomed before it had really begun. Most people handed this situation would have looked for the nearest exit. Alexander, characteristically, looked at it and saw a blank canvas. He understood something about money and credit that escaped nearly everyone around him, a set of insights drawn from all those years tracking ships and balancing ledgers and watching commerce flow across an ocean. It is worth appreciating, too, that he was not merely an author of clever plans, but the builder and manager of an enormous working apparatus. The Treasury quickly became by far the largest department in the new federal government, dwarfing the others, with a sprawling network of customs officials, collectors, clerks, and agents stationed at ports up and down the coast, all reporting up to the relentless secretary at the top. While Jefferson presided over a State Department staffed by a handful of people who could have comfortably shared a single carriage, Alexander commanded a small administrative empire, and he ran it with the same exacting attention to detail he had once applied to a single trading firm, now multiplied across an entire nation. This sheer institutional weight was itself a source of suspicion among his rivals, who looked at the size and reach of his department and saw the seeds of an overmighty government, a financial leviathan that might come to dominate everything. To Alexander, it was simply what a functioning modern state required. To his enemies, it looked uncomfortably like the foundations of exactly the kind of centralized power they had fought a revolution to escape. And over the months that followed, he poured those insights into a series of detailed written reports that would lay out in painstaking and brilliant detail his entire plan for the financial salvation and future greatness of the United States. These reports were not light reading. They were dense, technical, and exhaustive, the kind of documents that put most people to sleep faster than any bedtime story, but buried within their careful prose was nothing less than a complete blueprint for the American economy. The first and most important of these came in January of 1790, a document known as the Report on Public Credit, and its central argument was both simple and to many deeply shocking. Alexander insisted that the United States should pay back its debt in full, all of it, every dollar at face value to whoever currently held the debt, To a country drowning in obligations it could barely service, the idea of solemnly promising to pay back every last penny sounded frankly insane. Why on earth would a broke nation commit itself to honouring debts it could scarcely afford, when it might instead try to wriggle out of some of them, pay them back at a discount, or simply ignore the more inconvenient ones, as struggling governments throughout history have been only too happy to do? But Alexander's reasoning was as sound as it was counterintuitive, and it rested on an understanding of credit that was generations ahead of most of his contemporaries. A nation's ability to borrow money, he argued, depended entirely on its reputation for paying it back. If the United States established right from the start that it would honour its debts fully and faithfully, no matter how painful, then lenders around the world would come to see it as a safe and trustworthy place to put their money. That reputation, that good credit, would allow the country to borrow easily and cheaply in the future, which a young and growing nation would absolutely need to do in order to develop, to weather crises, and to fund its ambitions. In short, by treating its debt as sacred, the country would transform a crushing liability into the very foundation of its future strength. Paying your debts, in Alexander's vision, was not just about honour. It was about building the financial machinery that would let the nation grow rich and powerful. He essentially understood national credit ratings about 2 centuries before anyone invented the term, and he grasped, with unusual clarity, that money and trust were 2 names for the same thing. The mechanism by which he proposed to do all this was itself a small marvel of financial engineering. Rather than somehow scraping together $79 million in cash, which would have been as impossible as it sounds, Alexander proposed to convert the old, tangled, distrusted debts into new federal bonds that paid a dependable rate of interest. Holders of the old worthless paper could exchange it for these new, reliable government securities, and the government would commit to faithfully paying the interest on them year after year. To fund those interest payments, Alexander relied chiefly on customs duties, the taxes collected on goods imported into the country through its ports, which had the great political advantage of being relatively painless and largely invisible to ordinary citizens, who tend to notice a tax collector at their door far more than a small markup on imported goods. By turning a chaotic pile of dead debt into a steady stream of dependable, interest-bearing securities backed by a reliable revenue source, he transformed the nation's greatest weakness into a functioning, trustworthy financial instrument. It was, in its way, a kind of alchemy, turning the lead of bad debt into the gold of the good credit, except that it actually worked, which is more than the old alchemists could ever claim. But here is where the plan ran into a moral firestorm, and it is a controversy worth understanding clearly, because it cut to the heart of who deserved to benefit from the new nation's good faith. During the lean years of the war and after, when the government's debt was considered nearly worthless and its repayment a fantasy, many of the original holders of that debt, including ordinary soldiers and veterans who had been paid in government bonds for their service, had given up hope of ever being repaid. Desperate and broke, a great many of them had sold their bonds to speculators for a tiny fraction of their face value, taking pennies on the dollar simply to get some cash in hand. The speculators, gambling that the debt might someday be worth something, had snapped these bonds up cheaply, and now they sat on enormous potential profits if the government suddenly decided to pay the full value. And that is exactly what Alexander's plan proposed to do, which meant the windfall would flow not to the struggling veterans who had originally earned the debt, but to the speculators who had bought it from them at fire sale prices. To many, this seemed like a grotesque injustice, rewarding the wealthy financiers who had gambled on the country's misery while doing nothing for the patriots who had bled for it. Madison, in particular, was appalled and proposed a more complicated scheme to split the payments and give some compensation to the original holders. Alexander rejected this firmly, and his reasoning, while cold, was grounded in principle. A bond, he argued, was a piece of property, and the right to that property belonged to whoever currently and legally held it. If the government started picking and choosing who got paid based on sympathy rather than ownership, it would shatter the very confidence in property rights and contracts that the whole system depended on. Trying to track down every original holder would also be a practical nightmare of staggering proportions. It was a harsh position, and a genuinely debatable one, the kind of clash between abstract principle and human fairness that has no clean answer. But Alexander held to it because he believed the integrity of the entire financial system was at stake. To bend the rules even for the most sympathetic of reasons, he feared, would teach lenders that the government's promises were negotiable, and a government whose promises are negotiable cannot borrow when it truly needs to. The report on public credit contained a second explosive proposal alongside the matter of the national debt, and this one would prove even more politically divisive. Alexander argued that the federal government should take over, or assume, the debts that the individual states had run up during the war. This idea, known as assumption, had a clever strategic purpose beyond the merely financial. By making the central government responsible for the states' war debts, Alexander would bind the financial interests of the states and their creditors directly to the success of the national government. Wealthy people who were owed money would now look to the federal government for repayment, giving them a powerful personal stake in the strength and survival of the Union. It was financial policy as nation building, a way of using money to knit the loose states more tightly together. The problem was that the states had not all run up the same amount of debt, and they had not all been equally diligent about paying it off. Some states, particularly several in the South, had already worked hard to pay down most of their own war debts, and they were understandably furious at the suggestion that they should now be taxed by the federal government to help cover the unpaid debts of other states that had been less responsible. From their point of view, assumption meant being punished for their own good behaviour in order to bail out their spendthrift neighbours, which is the kind of arrangement that tends to make people reach for the political equivalent of a pitchfork. The proposal split the country along lines that were already beginning to harden, and it became the focus of a ferocious political battle. And it is here that the great rivalry of the era fully crystallized, the conflict that would shape American politics for decades and arguably ever after. Standing against Alexander were two formidable Virginians. One was James Madison, his former partner in the fight for the Constitution, who had now drifted firmly into opposition, increasingly alarmed by what he saw as Alexander's drive toward an overly powerful central government that favoured wealthy financial interests. The other was Thomas Jefferson, who had recently returned from his long stint as the American representative in France and had taken up his post as Secretary of State. Jefferson surveyed Alexander's financial schemes with deep suspicion and growing horror, seeing in them a betrayal of the agrarian, decentralized, liberty-loving republic he envisioned, and a dangerous slide toward the kind of moneyed, centralized, vaguely British-flavoured system he despised. The clash between these two visions was profound and genuinely substantive, not merely a personality squabble, though there was plenty of personal animosity to go around as well. Alexander dreamed of a strong, industrious, commercially vibrant nation with a powerful central government, sophisticated finance, manufacturing, and cities, a country that could compete with the great powers of Europe on their own terms. Jefferson dreamed of a nation of independent farmers, of decentralized power, of simple republican virtue, deeply suspicious of banks, financiers, and concentrated authority, which he associated with corruption and tyranny. These were two fundamentally different ideas about what America should be, and the men who held them came to view each other with a mixture of intellectual disagreement and personal loathing that makes modern political feuds look positively cordial. Out of this conflict grew the first political parties in American history, Alexander's Federalists on one side and the faction coalescing around Jefferson and Madison on the other, and the two-party system that still defines American politics traces its origins directly to this bitter quarrel inside Washington's own cabinet. The president, who had hoped to govern above the fray of parties, found his two most brilliant subordinates at each other's throats, which must have been delightful for him. Washington's position in all this was genuinely unenviable, and it deserves a moment of sympathy. He had assembled what he imagined would be a team of talented advisers, working harmoniously toward the common good, and instead he found himself presiding over what was rapidly becoming a feud of operatic proportions, with his Treasury Secretary and his Secretary of State each privately convinced that the other was steering the country toward catastrophe. Both men respected and even revered Washington, and both competed for his support, which placed the president in the awkward role of referee in a contest he had never wanted to officiate. He valued Alexander's brilliance and energy enormously, and he tended on the substance to side with him on the great financial questions. But he also took Jefferson's warnings seriously and laboured, with diminishing success, to keep the peace between them. Anyone who has ever tried to mediate between two strong-willed colleagues who genuinely despise each other will recognise the thankless misery of the task, though most such mediators are not also trying to run a brand new country at the same time. With the assumption plan stalled in Congress and the country deadlocked, the impasse was broken in one of the most famous backroom deals in American history, a bargain struck not in a legislative chamber, but over a private dinner. In June of 1790, Jefferson, perhaps sensing an opportunity to play peacemaker and broker, arranged a dinner at which he, Madison, and Alexander could hash out a compromise away from the public eye. And over that meal, on or around the 20th of June in 1790, the three men struck a deal that would shape the nation in the most literal sense. Alexander desperately wanted his assumption plan passed. Jefferson and Madison desperately wanted something else, namely the permanent national capital located in the South, on the Potomac River, close to their beloved Virginia, rather than in the commercial North. So they traded. Madison would arrange for enough Southern votes to allow assumption to pass, and in exchange Alexander would throw his support behind locating the future capital city on the Potomac. It was a clean, cynical, and enormously consequential piece of horse trading. Alexander got his financial system, securing the cornerstone of his economic plan, and the South got the capital, which is the reason the seat of American government sits today, where it does rather than in a bustling northern city. The next time anyone admires the grand buildings of the American capital, they might spare a thought for the fact that its very location was essentially the price Alexander paid to get his debt plan through Congress. History, it turns out, is sometimes decided over dinner by three men trading favours, which is either reassuring or alarming depending on your mood. It is also a reminder that even the most consequential statesmen were, in the end, practical politicians who knew how to count votes and when to make a deal. With the debt and assumption question settled, Alexander pressed forward with the next pillar of his grand design, and it was perhaps his most ambitious and controversial creation yet. In December of 1790, he proposed the establishment of a national bank, a central financial institution that would serve as the government's banker, hold its funds, issue a stable national currency, manage the debt, and provide credit to fuel commerce and growth. To Alexander, a national bank was an absolutely essential piece of modern financial machinery, the institution that would tie the whole system together and give the nation the flexible, reliable credit it needed to thrive. He had seen how such institutions worked in the great commercial powers of Europe, and he was determined that the United States should have one of its own, modelled in part on the long-established Bank of England that helped underpin British financial might. The proposal triggered a constitutional showdown that would echo through American history for centuries. Madison, Jefferson, and their allies opposed the bank fiercely, and they raised an objection that went straight to the foundations of the new government. Where, they demanded, did the Constitution actually authorize the federal government to create a bank? They searched the document and found no clause that explicitly granted such a power, and their philosophy of government, which came to be known as strict construction, held that the federal government possessed only those powers specifically and explicitly listed in the Constitution, and nothing more. If the power to charter a bank was not written down in black and white, then the government simply did not have it. Full stop. To grant the government powers not expressly stated, they warned, was to open the door to limitless federal authority and the eventual destruction of the states and individual liberty. Jefferson made this case to Washington directly and forcefully, and for a moment the entire bank hung in the balance, because the president was genuinely uncertain and was inclined to take the constitutional objections seriously. This forced Alexander to mount one of the most important constitutional arguments in American history, a defense that would shape how the nation understood its own founding document forever after. He responded with a doctrine that came to be known as broad or loose construction, and it rested on a particular clause of the Constitution, the provision often called the necessary and proper clause, which granted Congress the power to make all laws necessary and proper for carrying out its other explicitly listed powers. Alexander argued that since the Constitution clearly gave the government powers over things like taxation, borrowing money, and regulating commerce, it must also grant by implication the means reasonably needed to carry out those powers effectively. And a national bank, he contended, was exactly such a reasonable means, a legitimate tool for managing the government's finances, collecting taxes, and handling its money. The government did not need explicit permission for every single action, he argued, only the authority to take reasonable steps toward its legitimate constitutionally granted ends. This idea of implied powers was revolutionary, and it would become one of the most important principles in American constitutional law, vastly expanding the practical reach of the federal government over the following centuries. Washington, faced with these dueling arguments from his two most brilliant advisers, weighed them carefully and ultimately came down on Alexander's side. Persuaded by the logic of implied powers, he signed the bill creating the Bank of the United States into law on the 25th of February in 1791. It was a landmark victory for Alexander and for his expansive vision of what the federal government could do. The bank was established, the financial system gained another crucial component, and the principle of implied powers entered American law, where it would be invoked again and again over the centuries to justify federal action on everything imaginable. When shares in the new bank were offered to the public, the response was a frenzy. Investors scrambled to buy in. The price of the right to purchase shares shot upward almost overnight, and a wave of speculative excitement swept through the small world of American finance, with people who barely understood what a bank was nonetheless desperate to own a piece of one. It was a vivid early sign of both the promise and the peril of the financial world Alexander was conjuring into being. The promise was the flood of capital and confidence that such enthusiasm represented. The peril was that this same enthusiasm could curdle into reckless speculation and eventually panic, a lesson the country would learn rather painfully before very long. Jefferson and Madison were deeply alarmed, seeing the bank and the doctrine behind it as confirmation of their worst fears about Alexander's intentions, and the rift between the two factions only widened. Not content with reshaping public credit, assumption, and banking, Alexander then turned his restless mind to the future shape of the entire American economy, producing in December of 1791 what may have been his most visionary document of all, the Report on Manufactures. In it, he looked past the agricultural economy that dominated the America of his day and imagined something quite different, a nation that would also become a manufacturing and industrial power, building its own goods rather than depending on imports from Europe. This was a bold and forward-looking vision in a country that was overwhelmingly agrarian, and that included a great many people, Jefferson chief among them, who believed that farming was the only truly virtuous and proper basis for a republic, and viewed the rise of factories and industry with deep distrust. Alexander, drawing on the economic ideas circulating in Europe, including the influential work of the great economist Adam Smith, though departing from Smith in important ways, argued that the government should actively encourage and support the development of domestic manufacturing. The departure from Smith is worth a brief note, because it captures something essential about Alexander's practical, unsentimental cast of mind. Smith, the towering theorist of free markets, generally argued that economies flourished best when governments mostly stood aside and let trade flow freely according to its own logic. Alexander admired the analysis but drew a different conclusion for a young country in a hostile world. A fledgling American manufacturer, he reasoned, could not possibly compete against the established, efficient, deep-pocketed industries of Europe if simply thrown into open competition, any more than a child could be expected to win a fight against a seasoned heavyweight. The infant industries of a new nation needed protection and encouragement in their early years, he argued, until they grew strong enough to stand on their own. It was a pragmatic, hard-nosed view, less concerned with the elegance of economic theory than with the brute reality of building a competitive economy from a standing start, and it would echo in the policies of developing nations for centuries to come. He proposed a range of measures to nurture homegrown industry, including subsidies to help new manufacturers get established, protective tariffs to shield young American industries from being crushed by cheaper European competition, support for invention through patents that would reward and protect new ideas, and investment in the infrastructure, the roads and waterways, that commerce and industry would need to flourish. It was, in essence, a comprehensive blueprint for transforming the United States into a modern, diversified industrial economy, and it was extraordinarily ahead of its time. Many of his specific proposals were not adopted in his own lifetime, the agrarian suspicion of industry being too strong, but the broad vision he laid out, of an active government fostering industrial and economic development, would prove enormously influential in the long run, anticipating the path the nation would eventually take toward becoming an industrial powerhouse. Alexander, in other words, saw the industrial future of America coming from a great distance, while many of his contemporaries were still hoping it would never arrive. The grand financial system Alexander had constructed faced its first major test in the spring of 1792, and it came in the form of a financial crisis that threatened to undo everything he had built. The new world of government bonds, bank stock, and speculation that his policies had helped create had, perhaps inevitably, attracted reckless gamblers and overheated enthusiasm, and a speculative bubble had inflated around these new financial instruments. As bubbles always eventually do, this one burst. Prices collapsed, panicked investors scrambled, some prominent speculators were ruined, and for a frightening moment it looked as though the young nation's brand new financial markets might descend into chaos, dragging Alexander's whole carefully built system down with them. At the centre of the trouble was a man named William Dewar, who had the distinction of being both a former assistant of Alexander's at the Treasury and a spectacularly reckless speculator. Dewar had thrown himself into the new world of bonds and bank shares with the wild enthusiasm of a man who believed prices could only ever go up, borrowing heavily to fund ever larger gambles. And when the market turned against him, his elaborate house of cards came crashing down, taking a good many other investors with him. It was an early and instructive demonstration of a pattern that would repeat itself endlessly in the centuries to come, the eternal tendency of new financial markets to attract overconfident gamblers who mistake a rising market for their own genius, right up until the moment everything collapses. Alexander, who had created the very instruments these speculators were betting on, now had to clean up the mess made by people abusing his own creation, including a former subordinate, which must have been a particularly bitter flavour of irony. It was the kind of crisis that could have discredited everything he had worked for and confirmed every dark warning his enemies had made about the dangers of his moneyed schemes. But Alexander, faced with a financial panic, responded with a coolness and sophistication that, once again, was generations ahead of its time. Rather than letting the market collapse, he intervened decisively to stabilize it, directing the purchase of government debt to support its price and calm the panic, channeling funds to steady the markets and restore confidence before the crisis could spiral out of control. In doing so, he essentially carried out one of the first government interventions to rescue financial markets in a crisis, deploying techniques that central banks and treasuries would not formally develop and name for well over a century afterward. He understood intuitively that a financial panic feeds on fear, and that a calm, well-funded authority stepping in to provide stability could break the cycle and prevent a temporary scare from becoming a permanent disaster. The intervention worked. The panic subsided, the market stabilized, and Alexander's financial system survived its first serious trial, emerging arguably stronger for having weathered it. He had in effect written the first rough draft of the playbook that governments would reach for in every financial crisis to follow, though it would be a very long time before anyone gave him credit for it. By this point, the scale of what Alexander had accomplished in just a few short years was staggering, and it is worth pausing to take it in. He had taken a bankrupt, financially chaotic nation with ruined credit and built, more or less from nothing, the entire foundation of a modern economy. He had established the principle that the country would honour its debts, restoring its credit and its standing in the world. He had bound the states more tightly to the Union through assumption. He had created a national bank and a stable currency, established the doctrine of implied powers that would expand federal authority for centuries, laid out a visionary blueprint for industrial development, and demonstrated, in the Panic of 1792, how a government could manage and stabilize its financial markets in a crisis. It was an achievement of breathtaking ambition and skill, the work of a financial genius operating at the height of his powers, and it permanently shaped the economic destiny of the United States. But all of this had come at a tremendous cost in another currency, the currency of political enmity. Every triumph had deepened the hatred and suspicion of his opponents, and the rivalry with Jefferson and Madison had hardened into open, bitter political warfare. The two factions now eyed each other across an unbridgeable divide, each convinced that the other was leading the nation toward ruin, one toward a corrupt, monarchical, money-driven tyranny, the other toward weak, chaotic, mob-driven anarchy. Alexander had built the machinery of the American economy, but in doing so he had also helped build the machinery of American partisan conflict, and that conflict was about to consume an enormous amount of his energy and eventually threaten everything he had achieved. The architect of the nation's finances had made himself the most admired and the most hated man in America, often by the very same people, and the storms gathering around him were only going to grow more intense. The brilliant mind that had conjured an economy out of wreckage would soon find that politics, scandal, and his own unyielding temperament were challenges no financial report could solve. Before those gathering storms broke over him in full, there was the small matter of actually building the things he had designed, because a brilliant report is only a stack of paper until someone turns it into a functioning institution. This is the part of the story that usually gets lost in the grand drama of the great reports and the famous feuds, and it deserves attention because it reveals Alexander not just as a thinker and a writer, but as a builder, a man who physically constructed much of the machinery of the young federal government, brick by bureaucratic brick. The blueprints were magnificent, but blueprints do not collect taxes, mint coins, or chase smugglers. For that, you need real institutions staffed by real people doing real work, and Alexander set about creating them with his usual relentless energy. He had a genuine gift for the unglamorous craft of administration, the drawing up of procedures, the staffing of offices, the building of systems that would keep running long after their founder had moved on. And it is arguably this talent, even more than his famous reports, that left the most lasting mark on the country. One of his earliest and most enduring creations addressed a problem that was draining the new government before it had even properly started, which was smuggling. The customs duties on imported goods were, as we have seen, the lifeblood of the entire financial system, the steady revenue that funded the payment of the national debt. But that revenue only worked if the duties were actually collected, and a great many enterprising merchants had discovered that the simplest way to avoid paying import taxes was to quietly land their goods somewhere along the coast, without bothering to inform the authorities. With a long, lightly patrolled coastline and a thriving culture of getting around inconvenient rules, smuggling threatened to punch enormous holes in the government's income. So in 1790, on Alexander's initiative, the government created a small fleet of armed ships, 10 of them, tasked with patrolling the coast, intercepting smugglers, and enforcing the collection of customs duties. This force was known as the Revenue Cutter Service, and it has the distinction of being the direct ancestor of what is today the United States Coast Guard. The next time anyone pictures the Coast Guard rescuing sailors and patrolling the seas, they can thank a Treasury Secretary who simply wanted to make sure people paid their import taxes. It is not the most romantic origin story for a heroic maritime service, but it is an admirably practical one, and entirely fitting for a man who tended to solve grand problems through unglamorous, well-built machinery. Alexander also turned his attention to the basic question of money itself, which in the new nation was a chaotic muddle. The country was awash in a confusing jumble of foreign coins, varying local currencies, and inconsistent values, a holdover from the colonial days that made everyday commerce needlessly complicated, since a merchant might have to juggle Spanish, British, and various other coins, and somehow work out what any of it was worth. Alexander, who had spent his teenage years doing exactly this kind of currency juggling in a Caribbean counting house, knew the problem intimately and set out to fix it. He produced a detailed report on the establishment of a mint, laying out a plan for a national coinage and a unified monetary system based on the dollar. His proposals formed the foundation of the Coinage Act of 1792, which established a national mint in Philadelphia and created the unified dollar-based currency system that the United States uses to this day. The familiar American dollar, in other words, owes its basic structure to the same man whose face would, much later, and rather fittingly, end up printed on it. There was a pleasing logic to the design too. The dollar itself was modelled in large part on the Spanish silver coin that had been circulating widely throughout the Americas, a familiar and trusted piece of money that people already understood, and Alexander built his system around a decimal structure, dividing the dollar into convenient tenths and hundredths, rather than the cumbersome fractions of the old British system of pounds and shillings. Anyone who has ever tried to do arithmetic with the bewildering old British coinage, where the numbers seem designed to punish the unwary, can appreciate the quiet genius of simply counting in tens. The early mint faced no shortage of practical headaches, from securing enough precious metal to producing coins of consistent quality, and the new money trickled into circulation slowly at first. But the framework Alexander helped lay down proved remarkably durable, outliving him by centuries and forming the basis of one of the most important currencies in the history of the world. Then there was his most ambitious attempt to turn his industrial vision into bricks and mortar. Determined to prove that his dream of an American manufacturing economy was practical and not merely theoretical, Alexander helped establish, in 1791, an organization called the Society for Establishing Useful Manufactures, a private enterprise designed to demonstrate the potential of large-scale American industry. The society chose a site in New Jersey, near a powerful waterfall whose force could drive the machinery of factories, and there it founded a planned industrial town, the city of Paterson, intended to become a thriving centre of American manufacturing and a living embodiment of the ideas Alexander had laid out in his report on the subject. The grand vision did not quite materialize as he had hoped, at least not in his lifetime, as the venture struggled with mismanagement and the general difficulty of pioneering large-scale industry in a country not yet ready for it. Running ahead of one's era, it turns out, is its own kind of hardship. But Paterson did eventually grow into a genuine manufacturing centre in the decades that followed, becoming one of the early industrial hubs of the nation, a belated vindication of the founder who had seen its possibility long before almost anyone else. But the most dramatic episode of Alexander's state-building years grew out of the least glamorous part of his entire financial system, which was the simple, unavoidable, deeply unpopular business of taxation. To fund the payment of the national debt, the government needed reliable revenue, and Alexander, looking for sources beyond the customs duties, championed an excise tax, a tax on a domestically produced good. The good he chose was whiskey. On paper, it seemed reasonable enough. Whiskey was widely produced and consumed, and taxing it would bring in steady money. In practice, it turned out that Alexander had managed to pick possibly the single most provocative item he could have taxed, because for a great many people on the western frontier, whiskey was not merely a drink. It was a livelihood, a currency, and a way of life. To understand why a tax on whiskey nearly tore the country apart, you have to understand the world of the western frontier, particularly in the rugged country of western Pennsylvania. The farmers out there grew a lot of grain, but the roads were terrible, often little more than rough trails, and hauling bulky sacks of grain over the mountains to distant markets in the east was expensive and impractical. The clever solution, refined over generations, was to distill the grain into whiskey, which was far more compact, far more valuable by volume, and far easier to transport. Whiskey was so central to the frontier economy that it functioned almost as a form of money used to barter for goods and settle debts. So when the federal government, that distant and barely visible authority back east, announced a tax on whiskey, the frontier farmers did not hear a modest revenue measure. They heard a direct attack on their economy and their independence, imposed by wealthy Easterners who, in their view, had no understanding of frontier life and no business reaching into their stills. The reaction, unsurprisingly, was fury, and the fury escalated into open defiance. The frontier farmers had, after all, just lived through a revolution fought partly over the principle of resisting unjust taxes imposed by a remote government, and they found the parallel impossible to ignore. They simply refused to pay the tax. And when federal officials came around to collect it, things turned ugly. Tax collectors were harassed, threatened, and in some cases attacked, subjected to rough frontier justice by communities that had decided they would not submit. By 1794, what had begun as grumbling and refusal had swelled into a full-blown armed uprising, an organised and increasingly violent resistance that came to be known as the Whiskey Rebellion. Crowds gathered, threats were made against the government, and for a moment it looked as though a significant region of the country was in open revolt against federal authority. Liberty poles were raised in defiance, mock trials were held, and the rebels even flirted with the idea of organising their own separate authority, a frontier nation within the nation. It was exactly the kind of disorder and breakdown of law that Alexander had feared his entire life, the chaos he had been worrying about since the day he talked a mob out of harming a college president decades earlier. For Alexander, the rebellion was a profound test of everything he believed in, and the stakes could hardly have been higher. The entire point of all his labours, the whole reason he had fought so hard for a strong central government, was to create a nation that could actually function, that could enforce its own laws and command the obedience of its citizens. A government that announced a tax and then meekly backed down the moment people refused to pay and started threatening its officials was no government at all. Just the same feeble arrangement he had spent his life trying to escape, dressed in slightly better clothing. If the federal government could not enforce this law, it could not enforce any law, and the whole grand experiment would be exposed as a hollow sham. The rebellion had to be put down, decisively and unmistakably, to prove that the new government meant what it said, and so Alexander advocated for a forceful response, and the government assembled an enormous force to march west and crush the uprising. A militia army of nearly 13,000 men, a force larger than many of the armies that had fought in the actual revolution. In a remarkable display of how seriously the government took the threat, President Washington himself took the field at the head of this army, becoming the only sitting American president ever to personally lead troops in the field, a fact that tells you just how determined the leadership was to make a point. And Alexander, never content to direct events from behind a desk when there was action to be had, rode along with the army, personally accompanying the expedition into the western country. The sight of this overwhelming force advancing into the region had precisely the intended effect. The rebellion, faced with the prospect of confronting a massive army led by the towering figure of Washington himself, simply melted away. The rebels dispersed, the resistance collapsed, and the uprising ended with remarkably little actual bloodshed, which was the best possible outcome. The Whiskey Rebellion and its swift suppression was a landmark moment in the history of the young republic, and a personal triumph for Alexander's entire vision. It demonstrated, for the first time and beyond any doubt, that the new federal government possessed both the will and the capacity to enforce its own laws, even against armed resistance from its own citizens. The central authority that had once been so weak that it had to flee from a crowd of unpaid soldiers was now strong enough to field an army and impose its will across the mountains. It was the practical proof of everything Alexander had argued for since the days of the feeble Confederation, the demonstration that the United States was a real government with real power, capable of governing in fact and not merely on paper. His critics naturally saw something more sinister, a frightening display of federal military force used against ordinary farmers over a tax, confirmation of their darkest fears about where Alexander's love of strong central authority was leading. As with so much in his career, the very same event looked like a triumph of order to one side and a menace to liberty to the other, and both sides had a point. The deepening division that the Whiskey Rebellion exposed was, by this time, hardening into the permanent two-party split that would define the era. On one side stood Alexander's Federalists, drawing their strength from the commercial northeast, from merchants, financiers, and those who favoured a strong central government, a vibrant economy of trade and manufacturing, and, in foreign affairs, a generally friendly posture toward Britain, the great commercial power with which American trade was deeply entangled. On the other side stood the Republicans, the faction built around Jefferson and Madison, drawing their strength from the agrarian South and from those who championed the independent farmer, states' rights, and a more limited central government, and who, in foreign affairs, felt a deep sympathy and gratitude toward France, America's old revolutionary ally. These were not merely disagreements about policy, they were rival visions of what kind of nation America should be, and which foreign power it should align itself with, and they grew more bitter by the year. The battle between the two factions was waged with particular ferocity in the newspapers, which had become the great weapons of the age, and the warfare conducted in their pages would make a modern reader blush. Both sides sponsored and funded partisan papers, and the writing in them was savage, personal, and frequently unburdened by anything resembling fact. Politicians were accused of every imaginable vice, and a few unimaginable ones, often under classical pen names that fooled no one, and Alexander, a prolific and pseudonymous newspaper warrior himself, gave as good as he got, churning out anonymous essays attacking his rivals with the same tireless energy he brought to his financial reports. The notion that early American politics was a genteel affair of powdered wigs and dignified debate is one of the more charming myths people believe about the era. In reality, the founders insulted each other in print with a creativity and viciousness that would impress the most hardened modern troll, and they simply did it in more elegant sentences. Foreign affairs, in fact, became the great arena in which these passions exploded, because across the ocean, France had erupted into its own revolution, and that revolution was rapidly becoming something far darker and more violent than the American one had been. The French monarchy was overthrown, and in early 1793 the revolutionaries executed their king, Louis XVI, an act that sent shockwaves through the courts and capitals of Europe and horrified conservatives everywhere. Shortly afterward, Britain and revolutionary France went to war, plunging Europe into a vast conflict, and the United States, the small new nation across the sea, suddenly faced an agonizing dilemma. Both of the warring powers mattered enormously to America, Britain as its dominant trading partner, and France as the ally who had helped win its independence, and the country was sharply divided over which side, if any, to support. Alexander argued firmly for neutrality, for keeping the young and vulnerable nation out of the European war entirely. His reasoning characteristically was cold and practical rather than sentimental. The United States, he understood, was small, militarily weak and financially fragile, utterly unprepared to fight a war against a great power, and its prosperity depended heavily on trade, particularly trade with Britain, which controlled the seas. Getting dragged into a European war on either side would be catastrophic, threatening to wreck the economy and the credit he had so painstakingly built, and possibly the nation itself. So neutrality it had to be, not out of any great love for either side, but out of clear-eyed calculation about what the country could and could not afford. He had little patience for those who wanted to leap into the war on France's side out of revolutionary sympathy and gratitude, regarding such sentiment as a dangerous luxury the nation could not indulge. The neutrality question grew especially heated with the arrival of a French envoy, a man named Genet, who came to America and proceeded to behave with extraordinary boldness, essentially trying to recruit Americans to the French cause and act as though the United States were already a French ally, in flagrant disregard of the official policy of neutrality. Among other things, he set about arming private ships to prey on British vessels and tried to enlist Americans for French military ventures, all from American soil, which is a remarkable thing for a guest to do in a country that has politely declared itself neutral. His conduct was so provocative that it became a genuine diplomatic crisis, and he even threatened at one point to go over the head of the government and appeal directly to the American people, a gambit that managed to offend nearly everyone, including some who had initially been sympathetic to France. Alexander, working to undercut the troublesome envoy and rally public opinion behind neutrality, helped see to it that information about Genet's brazen behaviour reached the press, exposing the envoy's overreach to a public that did not appreciate a foreign agent treating their country as his personal recruiting ground. The episode helped turn American opinion against the French envoy and reinforced the policy of neutrality, but it also further inflamed the partisan divide, with the pro-French faction outraged and the pro-British faction emboldened. But the period that should have been the height of Alexander's triumph also contained the seeds of his deepest personal disgrace, and honesty requires telling this part of the story plainly, because it reveals the flawed human being behind the brilliant statesman. For all his genius and his fierce devotion to principle, Alexander was not immune to the ordinary failings of ordinary men, and he made a grave and damaging error in his private life. Over the course of roughly a year, Alexander carried on an extramarital affair with a woman named Maria Reynolds, betraying his wife Eliza, who had stood by him through everything. The affair was, by any measure, a serious moral failing, but it became far more dangerous than a private indiscretion because of who Maria Reynolds was connected to. Her husband, it turned out, was fully aware of the affair, and rather than being outraged, he saw an opportunity. He began blackmailing Alexander, extracting payments from the Treasury Secretary in exchange for keeping quiet about the relationship. Alexander, trapped by his own conduct, paid. This tangled and sordid situation set the stage for a political crisis, because in late 1792, a group of political figures, having caught wind of the suspicious payments Alexander was making, came to suspect that something improper was going on in his official capacity. They suspected that the Secretary of the Treasury, the man entrusted with the nation's finances, might be involved in some kind of financial corruption, perhaps using his position for illicit private gain, which would have been the gravest possible charge against the architect of the country's financial integrity. They confronted him with their suspicions, and here Alexander made a choice that tells you everything about how he ranked his priorities. Faced with the accusation of financial corruption, which would have destroyed his reputation as the honest steward of the nation's money, he chose to confess the truth about the affair instead. He admitted to the private, embarrassing relationship and the blackmail payments in order to prove that the suspicious payments had nothing to do with public corruption and everything to do with a personal scandal. To Alexander, his public integrity as a financial steward mattered more than his private dignity, and he was willing to confess to adultery to protect his record of honesty in office. The men who had confronted him, satisfied that there was no public corruption, agreed for the time being to keep the personal matter quiet. In January of 1795, after years of monumental labour that had remade the American economy and exhausted him in the process, Alexander stepped down from his position as Secretary of the Treasury. He had accomplished an astonishing amount, but the job had consumed him. The pay was modest and he had a family to support, which his government salary did not do especially well. He returned to his law practice in New York to earn a living, but he by no means retreated from public life. He remained one of the most influential figures in the country, a trusted advisor to Washington and the de facto leader of the Federalist faction, continuing to shape national policy from outside the formal government. One of the most consequential matters he influenced in this period was a controversial treaty with Britain, negotiated by John Jay, the same man who had helped write the great essays defending the Constitution years earlier. The treaty, known as the Jay Treaty, was designed to resolve lingering disputes with Britain, and above all to avoid a war that the United States could not afford. Alexander strongly supported and recommended the treaty, seeing it as essential to preserving the peace and protecting American commerce, even though its terms were widely seen as favourable to Britain and a bitter pill for American pride. The treaty succeeded in its central purpose, averting war with Britain and preserving the fragile prosperity of the nation, but it enraged the Republicans, who saw it as a humiliating capitulation to the British and a betrayal of the French alliance. The treaty became one of the most divisive issues of the decade, and Alexander, as its leading champion, drew enormous fire for it, even being pelted with stones at one point while defending it in public, which is a rather direct form of political feedback. There is a well-worn story that, struck by a stone while speaking, he remarked that if his opponents intended to use such weighty arguments, he would have to retire, the kind of cool wit under literal fire that was very much in character. Beneath the humour, though, the episode captured how poisonous the politics of the moment had become, with treaties debated by mob and missile as much as by reasoned argument. In 1796, as Washington prepared at last to retire from the presidency after 2 terms, Alexander performed one final great service for the man he had served for so long. Washington wished to issue a farewell address to the nation, a statement of guidance and warning for the future, and he turned to Alexander to help craft it. Alexander did much of the actual writing, shaping Washington's thoughts into the polished and enduring document that became known as the Farewell Address, a speech that warned against the dangers of excessive partisanship and entangling foreign alliances, and that by Washington's voluntary departure after 2 terms, established a tradition that presidents would honour for well over a century afterward. It was a fitting capstone to the long partnership between the 2 men, the brilliant pen once again giving eloquent form to the great commander's intentions, just as it had during the darkest days of the war. But the personal scandal Alexander had managed to contain in 1792 did not stay buried, and in 1797 it exploded into public view in the most humiliating fashion. The details of the old affair and the blackmail payments leaked out, and rumours swirled that the payments had, after all, been evidence of financial corruption during his time at the Treasury. Faced with this public accusation against his official integrity, the thing he prized above all else, Alexander made an extraordinary and characteristically stubborn decision. He chose to defend his public honesty by publicly and exhaustively confessing the private affair in full detail. He published a lengthy pamphlet laying out the entire sordid story of the relationship and the blackmail, sparing himself no embarrassment, in order to prove beyond doubt that the money had been about a personal scandal and not public corruption. It was an astonishing act of self-exposure, voluntarily airing his own deepest private humiliation before the entire nation to protect his reputation as an honest public servant. It worked, in the narrow sense that it convinced people he had not stolen public money, but it came at a tremendous cost. The pamphlet was a sensation. It deeply wounded his family, particularly his loyal wife, and it handed his political enemies an enormous gift, badly damaging his own standing and embarrassing the Federalist cause. Eliza, who had given him her steady devotion through every trial, now had to endure the spectacle of her husband's private betrayal laid out in print for the entire country to read and gossip about, a humiliation no one should have to bear and one she had done nothing to deserve. That she eventually forgave him and remained at his side speaks to a strength of character that arguably outshines anything her brilliant, reckless husband ever accomplished. It is one of the strangest episodes in American political history, a man so obsessed with his integrity and office that he was willing to publicly humiliate himself and his family to defend it, which is either a kind of warped nobility or a spectacular failure of judgment, and quite possibly both at once. Alexander's final years in public life were marked by mounting conflict, much of it with a man who should have been his ally, John Adams, the Federalist who succeeded Washington as president. Adams and Alexander, though nominally members of the same party, came to despise each other, a feud rooted in clashing temperaments, wounded pride, and genuine disagreements over policy. The conflict came to a head over questions of war and military preparation. In 1798, relations with France deteriorated badly after a diplomatic insult in which French agents demanded bribes before they would even negotiate with American envoys, an episode that became known as the XYZ affair and that inflamed American public opinion against France. The crisis pushed the country to the brink of war and led to a build-up of American military forces, including the creation of a substantial standing army. Alexander, ever the man of action and ambition, manoeuvred to secure for himself a senior command in this new army, effectively making himself its operational leader, which alarmed many who feared his appetite for military power. Adams, who wanted to avoid full-scale war and was deeply suspicious of Alexander's influence and ambitions, increasingly worked against him, and the two men's mutual loathing tore at the unity of the Federalist Party from within. The breaking point came when Adams, to the fury of the war-minded wing of his own party, made the bold and ultimately wise decision to send a new peace mission to France rather than plunge into outright war. The conflict with France at this stage was a strange, undeclared affair fought mainly at sea, a so-called half-war of naval clashes rather than a formal declared conflict, and Adams concluded that a full war would be a disaster and that peace was both achievable and preferable. He was very likely right, but his decision deflated the entire rationale for the large standing army that Alexander had been so eager to command, and it enraged Alexander and his allies, who felt the president had pulled the rug out from under them. From Alexander's point of view, Adams was erratic, vain, and impossible to work with. From Adams's point of view, Alexander was a scheming, power-hungry intriguer, trying to run the government from outside it. Both assessments contained more than a grain of truth, which is precisely what made the feud so corrosive and so impossible to mend. And then, on the 14th of December in 1799, the event that more than any other shattered the political world Alexander inhabited. George Washington died, the towering figure who had held the fractious new nation together through the force of his immense prestige, who had been Alexander's patron, commander, and partner for over 2 decades, was gone. The loss landed on Alexander as a deep personal grief, the severing of the single most important relationship of his public life, the bond with the man who had plucked him from obscurity and trusted him with everything. For the Federalist Party, his death was a catastrophe beyond that grief, because Washington had been the one unifying figure capable of holding the various factions and feuding personalities together. He was the glue, the figure everyone respected, the steadying presence that kept the squabbling under control. With him gone, there was no longer anyone who could bridge the bitter divide between Alexander and Adams, no one whose authority could impose unity on a party tearing itself apart. The Federalists were left leaderless in the deepest sense, fracturing under the weight of their internal feuds at the worst possible moment, with a crucial election looming. The loss of Washington removed the last restraint on the conflicts that had been building for years, and it set the stage for the final tragic act of Alexander Hamilton's extraordinary life, an act in which his obsession with honour, his political miscalculations, and his oldest enmities would converge with deadly consequences. The final act of Alexander's life opened, fittingly enough, with a political catastrophe largely of his own making, because if there was one thing Alexander could be relied upon to do at the worst possible moment, it was to let his fierce convictions and his sharper pen override every instinct toward caution. The presidential election of 1800 was approaching, shaping up as a bitter rematch between the incumbent John Adams and the Republican challenger Thomas Jefferson, and the Federalist Party, already fractured and leaderless after the loss of Washington, desperately needed unity to have any chance of holding power. What it got instead was Alexander Hamilton setting fire to his own house. By this point, Alexander's loathing for Adams had curdled into something that overwhelmed his political judgment entirely. The two were nominally on the same side, which somehow made it worse, since nothing fuels a feud quite like being trapped in the same party as someone you cannot stand. He sat down and composed a lengthy pamphlet that was, ostensibly, a private document intended for a select group of Federalist leaders, in which he tore into Adams with savage thoroughness, attacking the president's character, his temperament, and his fitness for office in withering detail. Attacking the leader of your own party in the middle of a crucial election is, to put it gently, an unusual electoral strategy, and it gets considerably worse because the pamphlet did not stay private. It leaked, as these things always do, falling into the hands of the opposition, who could scarcely believe their luck and gleefully made sure it reached the widest possible audience. The result was exactly what you would expect. Alexander had publicly savaged the sitting Federalist president, handing the Republicans a gift of incalculable value and splitting his own party right down the middle at the worst conceivable time. It was a stunning act of political self-sabotage, the work of a brilliant man whose inability to swallow his contempt for a rival blinded him to the obvious consequences. The Federalists, divided and demoralized, were heading for defeat, and Alexander had personally lit the fuse. The defeat of 1800 turned out to be more than a single lost election. It marked the beginning of the end for the Federalist Party as a national force, the slow fading of the political movement Alexander had done so much to build and lead. Jefferson's victory ushered in a long stretch of Republican dominance, and the Federalists, never again able to win the presidency, gradually dwindled into a regional faction and then into irrelevance, eventually vanishing from the scene altogether within a couple of decades. There is a melancholy aptness to the fact that Alexander, who had poured his genius into constructing the institutions of the new nation, belonged to the party that those very institutions would outlive by a wide margin. The machinery endured. The political vehicle that built it did not, and Alexander's own intemperate pamphlet against the leader of his party had helped hasten its decline, a final, costly demonstration that his greatest enemy was often his own inability to hold his fire when his pride was wounded. The election produced a tangle so strange that it nearly broke the new constitutional system, and to understand the mess you have to appreciate a quirk in how the system worked at the time. In those early days, electors did not cast separate votes for president and vice president. They simply cast 2 votes each, and whoever finished first became president while the runner-up became vice president, an arrangement that worked tolerably well right up until it spectacularly did not. The Republicans intended Jefferson to be president and a New York political operator named Aaron Burr to be his vice president. But their electors, in their disciplined enthusiasm, gave both men exactly the same number of votes, 73 apiece, producing a perfect tie between the man who was supposed to win and the man who was supposed to come second. The system had no graceful way to handle this. Under the rules, a tie threw the decision to the House of Representatives, where the lawmakers would have to choose between Jefferson and Burr to determine which of them became president. And here is where the situation became genuinely extraordinary, because the deciding voice in this drama turned out to belong to none other than Alexander Hamilton. The House was controlled by the Federalists, Alexander's own party, the people who had spent the last decade regarding Jefferson as their great ideological enemy and the embodiment of everything they feared. Many Federalists, reasoning that any port would do in a storm, were inclined to throw their support behind Burr simply because he was not Jefferson, calculating that the slippery New Yorker might be more pliable and less dangerous to their interests than the principled Virginian they despised. Alexander, however, saw it very differently, and what he did next reveals a great deal about the strange integrity that coexisted with his recklessness. Alexander hated Jefferson's politics with a passion, make no mistake. The two had been bitter rivals for years, their visions of America fundamentally opposed. But Alexander had something even stronger than his hatred of Jefferson, and that was his profound, almost visceral distrust of Aaron Burr. He had watched Burr operate for years in the world of New York politics, and he had concluded that the man was a creature of pure ambition without principle, an opportunist who believed in nothing but his own advancement, and who would say or do anything to gain power. Jefferson, whatever his faults, and however wrong Alexander considered his ideas, at least believed in something, possessed genuine convictions, and could be relied upon to act according to a coherent philosophy. Burr believed in nothing but Burr. And so Alexander reached a conclusion that astonished and infuriated many of his fellow Federalists. He threw his considerable influence behind Jefferson, his old enemy, arguing forcefully to his party that a man with dangerous principles was far less perilous than a man with no principles at all. It is a remarkable thing when you sit with it. Alexander Hamilton, at the end of a career defined by his opposition to Jefferson, used the last of his political capital to help make Jefferson president, because he judged the alternative to be a man too unprincipled to be trusted with power. After an exhausting deadlock that dragged on through ballot after ballot in the House, the impasse finally broke, and on the 36th ballot, on the 17th of February in 1801, Jefferson was elected president. Burr became vice president, the consolation prize, and he did not forget who had stood in his way. The whole chaotic episode so alarmed the country that it led directly to a change in the rules, an amendment to the Constitution requiring electors to cast separate votes for president and vice president, so that the system could never again produce such a dangerous tie between running mates. It was a sensible fix, born of a near disaster, and a small reminder that the founders were making much of this up as they went along, patching the machinery whenever it threatened to fly apart. Alexander had helped deny Burr the presidency, and he had done it by manoeuvring against him in the most public and consequential way imaginable. A man like Burr does not forgive that sort of thing, and the grudge that took root would, in time, prove fatal. But before the final confrontation with Burr, Alexander suffered a blow so devastating that it shattered something in him that never fully healed, and it arrived through the very code of honour that would later claim his own life. His eldest son, Philip, the bright and promising young man who had been born in the triumphant days after Yorktown, was a spirited youth of about 19, full of his father's fire and pride. In late 1802, Philip became embroiled in a quarrel with a man who had been making disparaging remarks about his father, and the dispute escalated, as these affairs of honour so often did, into a challenge to a duel. The whole grim ritual of duelling, which the gentlemen of this era treated as a sacred matter of honour, was about to take its first terrible toll on the Hamilton family. It is worth pausing to explain the strange institution that hangs over the end of this story, because to modernise the practice of duelling looks like pure madness, two grown men agreeing to shoot at each other over an insult. But in the world Alexander inhabited, a gentleman's honour was treated as his most valuable possession, more precious than his property and sometimes more precious than his life, and a public affront to that honour was something that could not simply be shrugged off. A man who declined a challenge, or who failed to defend his reputation, risked being branded a coward, which in that society could mean social and political ruin, the end of a career and a name. The duel was the elaborate lethal ritual by which gentlemen settled these matters, governed by a formal code with its own rules, its own appointed seconds to manage the affair, and its own choreography. Plenty of duels ended without anyone being hurt, the whole point often being the willingness to show up rather than the desire to kill, which makes the practice seem slightly less insane and considerably more absurd. But the pistols were real, and sometimes, as the Hamilton family was about to learn twice over, so was the death. Following advice that was meant to preserve his honour without bloodshed, Philip reportedly intended not to fire at his opponent. It did not save him. On the 23rd of November in 1802, young Philip Hamilton was mortally wounded in the duel, and he died, leaving his family devastated. The loss of Philip broke Alexander in a way that nothing else in his turbulent life ever had. This was the man who had survived being orphaned, who had endured poverty, war, scandal, and political ruin without ever losing his ferocious drive, and the death of his eldest son finally brought him to his knees. He sank into a profound and lasting grief, a darkness that those around him could see hanging over him in the months and years that followed. Some of the spark and the relentless ambition that defined his entire existence seemed to dim. He sought refuge from public life and from his sorrow at a country home he had built in the upper reaches of Manhattan, an estate he called the Grange, where he tried to find some measure of peace in family and quiet pursuits, a far cry from the man who had once seemed to thrive on perpetual conflict. The Grange offered a glimpse of a gentler Alexander than the country had ever known, a side of him that the relentless public warrior had rarely shown. He fussed over his garden, planting trees and tending to the grounds, with the earnest enthusiasm of a man discovering domestic life rather late, doted on his surviving children, and seemed, at long last, to be reaching toward something like contentment, or at least toward an exhausted peace after decades of ceaseless striving. There is something quietly poignant about the most driven man of his generation finally building himself a home in the country and learning to enjoy the ordinary pleasures he had spent his whole life racing past. He had been chasing greatness since he was a penniless boy, and now, in his grief, he seemed to be discovering that the small things might have been worth more all along. It would not last. The forces converging on him from his political past were about to drag him out of that fragile peace and onto the riverbank that had been waiting for him. The tragedy carried a cruel and bitter irony that would only deepen with time, for for the code of honour that had killed his son in a duel would, before long, claim the father in the very same way, on ground not far from where Philip had fallen. The final collision with Aaron Burr grew out of the wreckage of Burr's political career, a career Alexander had repeatedly helped to obstruct. By 1804, Burr, having been effectively sidelined by Jefferson and seeing his national prospects fading, turned his ambitions toward the governorship of New York, hoping to rebuild his power base at the state level. And once again, Alexander worked against him, just as he had during the presidential deadlock, using his influence to oppose Burr's candidacy. Burr lost the election badly, and in the wreckage of that defeat, his long-simmering resentment toward the man who always seemed to be standing in his path finally boiled over. He needed someone to blame for the collapse of his ambitions, and Alexander, his persistent nemesis, was the obvious and satisfying target. The specific spark was, as these things tend to be, almost trivial compared to the deadly consequences it produced. Word reached Burr of remarks Alexander had supposedly made about him at a private dinner, comments described as expressing a despicable opinion of Burr's character, the sort of disparaging assessment Alexander had been making about the man for years. In the rigid honour culture of the time, such an insult to one's character could not simply be ignored, at least not by a man as proud and as wounded as Burr now was. On the 18th of June in 1804, Burr sent Alexander a formal letter demanding an explanation or a retraction. What followed was an exchange of increasingly stiff and formal letters between the two men, a kind of ritualized dance in which each maneuvered around questions of honour, apology, and satisfaction. Alexander, characteristically, refused to grovel or to disavow opinions he had every intention of holding, and the correspondence failed to resolve the matter. Efforts to find a peaceful way out, to allow both men to step back with their honour intact, came to nothing. The machinery of the duel, once set in motion by the unforgiving rules of the code, ground inexorably toward its conclusion. Burr demanded satisfaction on the field of honour, and Alexander, trapped by the very honour culture he had served his whole life, felt he could not refuse without disgracing himself. This is the moment we glimpsed at the very beginning of this story, the dawn meeting on the river bank that had been waiting at the end of the road all along. There is a deep and tragic contradiction at the heart of Alexander's decision to accept the challenge. He had long expressed misgivings about duelling, the practice had just killed his beloved son, and his own religious and moral convictions weighed against it. By many accounts, he resolved in advance that he would not actually try to kill Burr. He intended, it seems, to throw away his shot, to fire harmlessly into the air, or simply not aim at his opponent, satisfying the demands of honour by showing up and standing his ground without taking a life. It was a desperate attempt to thread an impossible needle, to preserve his honour and his conscience at the same time, in a situation that offered no good options. Why a man with so much to live for, who privately opposed the whole bloody business, allowed himself to be drawn into it anyway is one of the enduring puzzles of his story, explicable only by understanding how completely the culture of honour gripped men of his class and his particular obsession with his own reputation, the thing he had guarded more fiercely than anything else his entire life. In the grey light of early morning on the 11th of July in 1804, the two men and their seconds crossed the river to a secluded ledge on the heights above Weehawken, on the New Jersey side of the water, a spot favoured for such encounters precisely because it was secluded, and because duelling, though widely practised, was illegal. There, in that quiet and lovely place, two of the most prominent men in the United States, the sitting Vice President of the nation and the man who had built its financial system from nothing, faced each other with pistols. The exact details of what happened in those few seconds have been debated ever since, with the accounts of the two camps differing on crucial points, as they always do when honour and blame are at stake. But the essential, terrible outcome is not in dispute. Shots were exchanged. Alexander, whether by his prior resolution or by the chaos of the moment, did no harm to Burr. Burr's shot struck Alexander in the body, inflicting a grievous wound that the medicine of the era had no hope of mending. He fell, mortally injured, and he knew at once that the wound was fatal. The stricken man was carried back across the river to the city, to the home of a friend, a banker named William Bayard, where he was laid down and tended to as well as the helpless doctors could manage, which is to say not at all, for nothing could be done. He lingered in agony for a day, surrounded by his shattered family, including the wife who had already endured so much at his hands, and who now had to watch him die, and the loss of the son still fresh in all their memories. he received the comforts of religion, he said his farewells, and on the following afternoon, the 12th of July in 1804, Alexander Hamilton died. He was, by the most likely reckoning of his murky birth year, only around 49 years old. The orphan from the Caribbean, the artillery captain, the indispensable aide, the architect of the Federalist Papers and the American economy, the man who had risen from absolutely nothing to shape the destiny of a nation, was gone, brought down at last not by his enemies in war or his rivals in politics, but by a pistol on a riverbank over a matter of words and wounded pride. The reaction to his death was enormous, an outpouring of grief that swept across the country and revealed how deeply, for all his controversies, Alexander had mattered. His funeral in New York was a vast and solemn affair. The city draped in mourning, crowds lining the streets to watch the procession of a man who had done as much as anyone to build the world they lived in. Business was suspended, flags were lowered, and a great oration was delivered over his body by a prominent associate, a speech that moved the enormous crowd to tears as it recounted the astonishing arc of his life and the magnitude of the loss. Even many who had opposed him in life, who had cursed his policies and feared his ambitions, were stunned into grief by the manner of his death, the sheer waste of it, a towering talent extinguished over a quarrel that honour demanded but reason condemned. The outpouring revealed something that the bitter partisanship of his final years had obscured, which was the depth of respect and even affection that the man had commanded, the recognition, however grudging, that the country had lost one of the rarest minds of its founding generation. As for Burr, the duel destroyed him. Though he was the survivor, he was the loser in every way that mattered. He was vilified as a murderer, his already battered reputation collapsed entirely, charges were brought against him, and though he was never convicted, he was finished as a respectable public figure. He drifted through the rest of his long life as an outcast, the man who had killed Alexander Hamilton, a label that followed him to his grave. He had pulled the trigger and won the duel, and in doing so he had annihilated himself far more thoroughly than he had his opponent. His later career only confirmed the dark assessment Alexander had always held of him. In the years after the duel, Burr embarked on a bizarre and murky venture in the Western Territories, a scheme so ambiguous that historians still argue about exactly what he intended, but which involved raising an armed force for purposes that looked alarmingly like an attempt to carve out his own personal dominion or provoke a war. The affair ended with Burr arrested and put on trial for treason, one of the most sensational legal spectacles of the young nation. He was acquitted, the evidence falling short of the strict legal standard, but the trial cemented his reputation as a dangerous adventurer who would stop at nothing, exactly the sort of unprincipled schemer Alexander had warned his fellow Federalists about during the deadlocked election years earlier. It is one of history's grimmer ironies that the unprincipled man Alexander had warned about spent his remaining decades as living proof that Alexander had been right about him all along. The widow Alexander left behind, Eliza, deserves the final word in the human part of this story because her chapter did not end with his. Having already lost her eldest son and now her husband, she was left with a houseful of children and a mountain of debt, since Alexander, the man who had managed the finances of an entire nation, had, as we noted, never managed his own with any particular skill, and died far from wealthy. But Eliza proved to be made of extraordinarily durable stuff. She lived on for half a century after her husband's death, surviving him by some 50 years, and she devoted that long widowhood to two great causes. The first was charitable work, including helping to establish an orphanage in New York, a fitting tribute from the widow of a man who had himself been an orphan, and who had never forgotten where he came from. The orphanage she helped found endured and grew, continuing its work with vulnerable children long after she was gone, so that her quiet labour outlasted her, just as her husband's institutions outlasted him, a gentler monument standing beside the grander ones. The second was the relentless, determined preservation and defence of her husband's legacy and reputation, gathering his papers, correcting the record, and making sure that the world would remember what Alexander Hamilton had done. In a very real sense, a significant part of why we know his story at all is because of the devotion of the wife he had wronged and who loved him anyway, a quiet heroine who outlasted everyone and guarded the memory of a flawed and brilliant man for the rest of her very long life. Now, what did all of it amount to in the end? The legacy Alexander left behind is, quite simply, woven into the fabric of the modern United States in ways so fundamental that they are easy to overlook precisely because they are everywhere. the financial system he constructed, the commitment to national credit, the banking framework, the embrace of commerce and manufacturing, the vision of an energetic central government actively shaping the economy became the foundation upon which American capitalism was built. The bank he founded in New York long before his Treasury days outlived him by centuries. His principle of implied powers became one of the most consulted ideas in constitutional law, and his insistence that a nation must honour its debts became so deeply embedded in American practice that it is now simply taken for granted, which is perhaps the highest compliment any reformer can receive, to have his radical idea become so ordinary that nobody remembers it was ever in doubt. The country that grew into the greatest economic power the world has ever seen did so along lines that Alexander, more than anyone, had drawn at the very beginning, when the nation was bankrupt and the whole thing could easily have collapsed. His rival Jefferson dreamed of a republic of simple farmers, and that dream had its own enduring power, but it was Alexander's vision of an industrial, commercial, financially sophisticated nation that more closely predicted what America would actually become. In the long argument between the two men about the soul of the country, Alexander, the foreigner, the orphan, the outsider, turned out in many ways to have seen the future most clearly. That argument, in truth, never really ended, and it is one of Alexander's stranger legacies that the debate he and Jefferson began over 2 centuries ago is, in its essentials, still going on today. The fundamental questions they fought over have echoed through every era of American history since. How much power should the central government have, and how much should belong to the states? Should the government actively shape and steer the economy, or stand back and let it run itself? Is the nation's destiny industrial and commercial, or something else? And who is the country really for, the merchant and the manufacturer, or the farmer and the small landholder? Every generation of Americans has refought versions of the Hamilton and Jefferson quarrel under different names and different banners, often without realizing that the script was written by 2 brilliant feuding men in a new president's cabinet long ago. To understand that original disagreement is, in a real sense, to understand the basic fault line of American political life ever since, which means that the orphan from the island did not just build the country's finances. He helped define the very terms of its endless argument with itself. For a long time after his death, however, Alexander was curiously underappreciated, overshadowed in the popular memory by the more celebrated founders, the presidents, and the household names. He had never been president. His reputation carried the stains of the great scandal and the political feuds, and his vision, associated with banks and finance and federal power, was easy for later generations to take for granted or to view with suspicion. For more than a century, he was a figure known mainly to historians and schoolchildren memorizing names, his face on the currency a familiar but largely unexamined presence, the man most people could not quite place. The deep irony was that the architect of the nation's money had become one of its more forgotten founders, hiding in plain sight in everyone's wallet. That neglect, remarkably, has been almost completely reversed in our own time, through the unlikely power of popular culture. Interest in Alexander flickered up periodically over the years, including through a stage play in the early 20th century and a film adaptation in the early 1930s that brought his dramatic story to new audiences. But the truly extraordinary revival came in 2015, with the debut of a wildly successful stage musical that told his life story, set to modern music and performed by a diverse cast, which became a global cultural phenomenon of staggering proportions. Almost overnight, the forgotten founder became the most famous of them all, his life story devoured by millions of people who had never given a thought to early American finance, his name suddenly everywhere. The orphan immigrant who had spent his life desperate to be remembered, who had craved fame and glory and recognition with an almost painful intensity, achieved a posthumous celebrity beyond anything he could have dreamed. More than 2 centuries after a pistol shot ended his life on that riverbank, the forgotten man in the wallet had become, against all odds, a household name once more. This sudden surge of renewed fascination even shaped his fate in the most literal modern sense. For around the time his story was being rediscovered, there had been serious discussion of redesigning the nation's currency in a way that might have removed his portrait from the $10 bill, replacing him with another figure. The wave of renewed admiration and affection for Alexander, fueled in no small part by his cultural revival, helped change those plans, and his face was kept on the money he himself had been so instrumental in creating. There is a perfect, almost poetic justice in that. the penniless, illegitimate orphan who arrived from a tiny island with nothing but a brilliant mind and a burning ambition, who built the financial system of a great nation and then was nearly forgotten by it, endures to this day on its currency, his image carried in the pockets of a country he did more than almost anyone to bring into being. He wanted, above all, to matter, to rise above the obscurity of his birth and leave a mark that could never be erased. And by any measure, he succeeded beyond all reckoning, his legacy printed on the very money that flows through the economy he designed, a quiet, permanent monument to a life that began with nothing and changed everything. And so the story comes full circle, from a small boy reading borrowed books on a sugar island to a man whose face the whole world would come to know, from a clerk balancing a trader's ledgers to the mind that balanced the accounts of a nation, from an orphan who belonged to no one to a founder who in a sense belongs now to everyone. It is a story almost too neat to be true, and yet every improbable turn of it actually happened. His was a life of dazzling brilliance and grievous flaws, of soaring triumphs and self-inflicted wounds, lived at full speed and ended far too soon, and it remains one of the most improbable and compelling stories in the whole sweep of history. The cannons and the quarrels have long since fallen silent, the rivalries have faded into the calm of the past, and what remains is the extraordinary arc of a single human being who refused to accept the smallness of the place the world had assigned him, and who, through sheer relentless will and genius, wrote himself into the foundations of a country. So with that, we have reached the end of our journey through the remarkable life of Alexander Hamilton. Thank you for spending this time wandering through history with me, for letting these old stories keep you company through the quiet hours. From a sugar island to the founding of a nation, his was a life that proved just how far a single determined mind can travel against impossible odds. Now let the candles burn low, rest your eyes, and let your mind drift gently into the quiet. Good night to you all, wherever you are, and may your dreams be sweet and peaceful.